e-bikes have become popular in the last little bit? I'm sure everybody rides e-bikes in Austin.
There's a lot of it in Austin. It's mostly downtown and a huge number of them on campus. Now, during the pandemic, that dropped off. But that popularized it. They started offering the ride service, and it's because of the
ride service. What's that?
You can rent the e-bike for a while. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until this was very widespread in Austin that anybody ever thought about buying it themselves.
I also want it must have to do with how batteries have developed too.
Oh, sure.
It's made it a lot more feasible to put
longer.
a light-ish
They're faster
battery.
charging. They're slower discharging. They hold more power. Yeah.
How long have you been in Austin?
Since 1981.
Wow. I was 2 years before gestation at that point.
Is that right?
Just to make you feel old.
Look, I already feel old.
I don't need that. 1981. And what's the university? University of Austin?
No, there is a startup called the University of Austin, which is very controversial, but it advertises itself as a non-PC university, but they aren't in operation yet. They're just projecting. No, mine is the University of Texas at Austin. It's the one run by the state university system.
Okay.
Supposedly the flagship, although several other universities in the state university system compete for that honor.
Yeah. Were you a Catholic when you started teaching philosophy?
Oh, no. When I started...
This is wonderful. I know a bit about your story, but not enough that I have to pretend to be interested in what you're about to say, because I'm
Well, no, that's great. But when I first began teaching, I was still further out even than Nietzsche. I was a nihilist.
Okay.
I had lost the Christian faith in which I was brought up. I was baptized when I was 10. I was a Baptist. Our family was Baptist. My grandfather was, I think, the first Polish Catholic minister with a Polish-speaking congregation in the United States. I'm not certain he was the first, but I think he was. He was a great man. They taught me the gospel. I abandoned all that though when I was around the age when I went off to college.
How and why?
Well, I would like to have said that I was convinced by superior arguments.
We good, Neil? Okay, good.
I would like to have believed that, but it wasn't true.
It wasn't the arguments.
No, it wasn't the arguments. I thought that it was because I was so smart, but really it was because in my intellectual milieu, the smart people didn't believe in God or didn't take God very seriously, and my culture heroes were all socialists. I'd fallen for this idea that the right way to think about Jesus was just as a cultural revolutionary, and stopped believing in him. Then I found myself it wasn't that one day I said, no, I don't believe in him. It's that one day I realized I haven't believed in him for a while.
Yeah.
It wasn't as though then I stopped believing in God at all. It's that one day I realized that I hadn't been believing in him for a while. And then you start throwing all that stuff out. You start throwing out, it's like, think of it this way. I know we're not computers, but the metaphor is useful for some purposes. Opening up the access panel of your mind and pulling out every component that has God's initials on them. Can't think about that. Can't remember that. Can't remember that experience, that kind of thing. Can't believe that. And the problem is, since we're made in God's image, every one of the components is his image on it. So you pull out component after component. And I just about got to the motherboard when he...
Meaning you were suicidal?
Well, I was, but I had inherited inhibitions that were so strong against suicide that I never really seriously considered it. But I thought I would have liked to die. Even after coming back to faith, I thought that for a while, but for different reasons, even more strongly, because I thought, okay, thank God you brought me back to yourself. But I have wrecked myself so badly, even you can't use me anymore, which turned out to be wrong.
Yes, it did. Yeah,
he can, in fact, repented craziness works very much to his advantage. So I was still in this state but miserable when I began to teach at the University of Texas. I was there are pop culture nihilists. I'm nihilistic and it's cool. There are existential dread nihilists. I don't believe there's any meaning in anything and it's awful. And I had a little bit of that, but I was mostly a macho nihilist. I'm one of the tough ones who sees that there's that at the core of the universe there's nothing at all, and I can believe that and live.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So I was still into that when I began to teach at the University of Texas.
Just real quick, you said you weren't convinced by arguments for atheism, and yet
that's correct.
You were teaching, so you must have entertained some thoughts or arguments from Nietzsche and others.
Oh, sure. I was teaching, and I had the strangest inhibition, although Nietzsche had profoundly influenced me, the God is dead guy. I had the strangest inhibition against teaching Nietzsche to my students.
Could you break down Nietzsche briefly for those who are watching? Because I think a lot of Catholics go, okay, Nietzsche, nihilist maybe, also a very witty writer, had some interesting things to say that I actually appreciate.
Well, it's hard to break him down because he was incoherent. Nietzsche, toward the end, believed that even what we call thought, even rationality is just it isn't what it appears to be. It isn't about finding the truth. It isn't about thinking thoughts that conform to reality. It's just a form of intellectual life that we can't escape. He thought that everything is really the feelings, the affects, sending semaphore signals to each other as though with flags. So really, if you take that seriously, it's not just that what we believe. Well, for instance, he said God is dead. Why didn't he just say there's no God? Well, because he didn't really think that our thoughts are in touch with reality at all. Our thoughts actually create reality, so to speak, such as it is. As
not in the Kantian sense, or
no,
far more removed.
No, Kant thought that we have these thoughts that sort of organize reality and are regulative hypotheses, and he knew about that, but he took it one step farther. So we believed in God, and now we don't construct the universe that way anymore. God is dead, and we just haven't noticed it yet. So he thought that. He even said things like it would be better for us really if consciousness was just something that happened in our evolution, which seems to have been unfortunate. It would be better to be unconscious.
Yeah.
That a lot of bizarre stuff. I wrote an essay about it years and years ago in 1988, and I should post it online. But I wrote the essay because by that time I had come back to faith, and it was a penance. Now, I wasn't Catholic yet. I was a Protestant Christian, and there was no idea of penance in Protestant tradition, but I just thought I needed to do this. I needed to do it, and it was necessary to say goodbye to all that, to put it behind me. It had wrecked me so much. I used to go over to my shelf of all these books by Nietzsche, and I'd shake.
And you would shake.
I'd shake, yeah. And so when I have students who start shaking when they talk to me about serious things, I know that they're not all faking. Yeah. They're not all just melodramatic. But I wrote this and explained the problems and explained the crazy attraction, and so I didn't shake anymore.
During these first few years, and I can't wait to get to that. During these first few years when you were teaching at Austin as an atheist, if somebody had come up to you and said, "Well, why think there is no God? Is there any good reason to think that?" What would you have said?
I have no idea what I would have said then. I'll tell you what a student did say to me once, though. I had been teaching Thomas Aquinas, of all things. Now, I had an introduction to political philosophy, which was my field, but I specialize in the ethical foundations of political thought, of political order. So, there was a unit on Aristotle and then his Nicomachean Ethics. There was the old pagan philosopher. There was a unit on Thomas Aquinas. During the Aquinas unit, now you have to understand, Aquinas by this time was powerfully attractive to me because it gave such a strong appearance of the truth. And I kept telling myself, but it can't be. But it can't be. There isn't any truth that the mind can apprehend. This is all an illusion.
Yeah.
And So a student came up to me after class one day and he said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" I said, "Well, you can ask. I don't guarantee that I'll answer, but go ahead." He said, "I've been listening to you all semester, and I figure you're either an atheist or a Roman Catholic. I can't tell which." That was one of the funniest things anybody ever said to me.
It is a very funny thing.
I think he had some sense of where I was headed before I did.
Interesting.
Although, things like that, people said things like that to me before when I was still doing my PhD at Yale. A professor that I knew came up to me. I hadn't ever taken a course with him, but I knew him, and he said, "So what are you working on these days?" And I said, "Oh, I've been studying Nietzsche." And he said, "Nietzsche?" He says, "You shouldn't read that guy. The next thing you know, you'll be a Christian." He meant, I think, by recoil. And
pendulum swing sort of
pendulum
thing.
I don't know what he meant exactly, something like that. So anyway, it was within about a year and a half after coming to the University of Texas that I did regain my faith. It's the strangest thing. I gave a job talk and basically told them I don't believe that there's a rationally discernible difference between good and evil, and I don't think we're responsible for our actions. And I think
this was a talk you gave on campus.
Oh yeah, to my department.
Yeah,
and I think that the study of politics has to be reconfigured along those lines. And they should have said, send the guy down to the local mental institution, but they said give him a job teaching the young. They didn't start worrying about me when I returned to Christian faith. Then people found me very alarming.
If you don't mind sharing, you say it shook you and kind of ruined you. What do you mean by that? Just intellectually, or did you begin engaging in behaviors that were destroying you?
Like a lot of quote unquote intellectual people, a lot of what goes wrong is up here, right? And you don't necessarily doesn't express it in actions. For instance, I didn't start sleeping with other women besides my wife. And I have to say, I developed some really good habits as a young Baptist boy, and they carried me even through this nihilistic phase. But I did love my wife, and I loved my children. I had 2 kids already by this time. We married at 19. And but to think about that. Love is a commitment of the will to the true good of the other person. Now, I didn't believe in an objectively valid distinction between good and evil. I didn't believe any longer in persons. And I didn't believe that our commitments are in our control. So it's not that I didn't love her, but I couldn't even make sense of this love. Now, that's a dreadful position to be in. To some people it might sound kind of kooky, abstract, but this is really dreadful. Mm-hmm. After a while, it wasn't such a macho fun thing to do, to think that I was so tough that I could believe this. I thought, if the universe is like this, this is really dreadful. One very well-known philosopher, Thomas Nagel, wrote an article about the absurd, and he said, well, if everything's absurd, if nothing makes any sense, then we don't need to worry about it either, because that would be absurd.
And yet we do.
And yet we do. And I want to say to him, well, if nothing makes any sense, then why are you coming up with a solution for the problem of absurdity? Why are you saying, we'll feel better then if we stop worrying about it? That doesn't matter either. So I just as I had drifted out of faith, just because I was in an atmosphere in which it seemed as though I saw through all of that. When God brought me back to faith, there's a story there too, but when he brought me back, I was never aware of any moment at which I began believing. But again, I became aware that for some time now I had been believing again.
Sort of like not knowing the exact moment you wake up, huh?
Something like that. And I had told him about 6 weeks before this.
Told who this?
God. I had told God. I said, at a moment of sorrow, I said, I don't believe you're there. I think I'm talking to the wall. But if you are there, you can have me. But you're going to have to show me, because I can't tell anymore. Well, he did, actually. He did. And it used to distress me very much for about 2 years, because it took about 2 years to put my mind back together, to start learning how to think about things like responsibility, like like guilt and merit and good and evil and all these kinds of things again, it was hard. But it distressed me that I couldn't trace an intellectual path. I was convinced by this argument and this argument and this argument, and realized, therefore, God really does exist at all. It didn't happen that way. It was only much later that I could say, here is why it does make sense.
I think that tends to be the case. When people become atheists or become Christians, it seems to me in my experience chatting with people that it's the arguments that come after the fact that then solidify the belief.
Well, yes, I think that is often the case.
And justify
the arguments sometimes have a role because they shatter the preconception that no rational person, no intelligent person could believe this. You say, well, this looks like an argument, all right. It looks reasonable, but I, as I say, it was distressing. And then years later, I realized, but wait a minute. I had lost my faith through an excess of intellectual pride. I'd lost my faith because I thought I was so darn smart. I wanted J. Budziszewski to be God. I didn't want God to be God. And so he had to bring me back by a path that I could take no intellectual pride in.
Was it distressing for your wife at the time that you said you loved her and yet didn't believe that she existed in the sense of her personality?
Well, my wife was going through her own process now, but when I would say things like this to her, I would say, oh, there's no rationally discernible difference between good and evil, blah, 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 blah. She would just laugh at me and say, you know better than that. And curiously, one of the things that became clear after returning to God and after returning to moral sanity is she was right. It wasn't that during that period I had been ignorant of the reality of God and ignorant of the reality of good and evil and ignorant of all of that. It's that I was telling myself that I was. I told myself that I didn't know what I really did know, which is one of the reasons why now, there are a lot of really good natural law thinkers out there, and I study the natural law, but most of them do something different than I do. They either say, well, let's do some ontology here. What must the universe be like for there to be such a thing as moral law, as a natural law? What kind of a thing, how do we have to think about nature for there to be a natural law? Or they do casuistry. Could natural law give us the answer to difficult moral questions? Can we work this out? Or they do cultural apologetics. Armed with natural law, can we more easily persuade people? But a large part of what I do is I try to understand from a natural law point of view how self-deception works. How you can lie to yourself. How you can tell yourself that you don't know what you really do know and what that does to you and what it does to a society, because I think we're doing that to ourselves collectively. Look at the things that we pretend to ourselves. There have been a lot of troughs, moral troughs in history before, when people were pretty wicked, lost sight of the virtues. But in most of those periods, people pretty much admitted that they were scoundrels. They didn't pretend that there was no difference between good and evil. We're passing through a weird, eerie phase of history where vice has the high moral ground, and we pretend not to know the things that we really do know. The most obvious things.
I've been thinking of Raskolnikov the whole time, from Crime and Punishment.
Yes.
This idea of looking at the world, thinking there's no discernible good and evil as you did, and then deciding he was one of the strong people who would act in accord with that belief.
Would act, yeah.
But you didn't do that.
I didn't do that.
Why not? I mean, because often when I'll chat with
because I lived so much in my head.
Well, when I talk with moral relativists, who are really moral relativists, I don't know if there's that many of them, but you say, okay, try living like that. Or, and so what's the solution?
I don't think that there are any, actually.
Really?
As far as I know, every moral relativist I've encountered has been a selective moral relativist. The relativist kicks in when it comes to something that he wants to do, sex maybe, or justifying cheating on the test or something. All of a sudden now he's a relativist, but somebody tries to steal his car and he's full of righteous indignation.
I see. Yeah, Dawkins is a lot like that. You notice that? He speaks with strong moral language.
Yes.
And also denies objective morality.
Yeah. And there are all kinds of paradoxical defenses of toleration like that. Why should we practice toleration? Why should we regard toleration as a moral virtue? Because there is no moral good and evil. We can't make moral judgments. Therefore, we make the judgment that it is wrong to suspend moral judgments.
Right.
It's crazy. But that was a footnote, and I don't think I answered your question. What was it again?
I forget. That's okay.
Well, if we've both forgotten, that's fine.
I mentioned Raskolnikov because...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I guess because it was all in my head. This was another problem for me. Sometimes things that were going on up here were more real to me than things going on out there.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things, this is one of the great things about being married to my wife. She's very perceptive about other people. She knows what's going on. Around her, she understands. And I've had to learn a lot of things from her. Like, how do you judge character? How do you, I've had to learn respect for common sense. And
yes.
It was a very late discovery for me. It should have been a very early one. I'd read Aristotle. Aristotle's all over this. Philosophy begins in common sense. It doesn't begin by throwing it out the window. It begins in it. Where else would you begin?
Yeah.
But you try to elevate it and purge it of inconsistencies and errors, and use one part of common sense to cross-examine another part of common sense, and you make your way along. So, I had to. So this kind of intellectual elitism was part of the problem for me.
What's wrong with finding yourself here on this planet at any age and looking around and saying, look, I don't know if God exists, and so I don't know if there's any objective, mind-independent commandments or prohibitions. But what I do know is if I act in a certain way, I tend to get along better with others, and they tend to reciprocate. Mm-hmm. And that's a much more pragmatic way of going about things than just being a jerk and being selfish. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, I'm going to act in a way that's conducive to my own good and the good of my nation or my group, and just call that good. Give it the word good, and give things that go against that the word evil. What's wrong with thinking of it that way?
Well, that's not wrong. It's just incomplete. If I was speaking to somebody and that's what he says, I would begin where he is. I would affirm what I could affirm and what he's saying. Yes, it's true, because in think of it this way. Classical natural law theory, natural law thinkers use all kinds of different names for this, but these are my names for it. St. Paul once talks about how God did not leave himself without witness among the pagans. And the witnesses he talks about aren't human witnesses. They're things in the order of creation. So I like to say that there are 4 witnesses, and natural law thinkers weave them all together. There's deep conscience. That's the deep structure of the moral intellect there. That's natural. There is the recognition of the designedness of things. There's the recognition of the details of the design. Why do I have a mind? What's it for? What is the heart for? Well, it pumps blood. Why do I have a capacity to think, to deliberate so that I can make good choices? Why do I have a capacity for anger so that I can arouse myself to the proper defense of endangered goods? That's the details of the design. Why is it that what is it about being a social being that the good life for me isn't even good unless I can share it with other people? That's a detail of the design. So we've got deep conscience, we've got the designedness of things, which points to the designer. You've got the details of the design, and then the very last one is the witness of natural consequences. And that's what the fellow that you're imagining, that's the one where he's putting all his cards. He says, you live certain ways and it messes you up. He's right. That's one of the ways that we know the natural law, but you need the other 3 witnesses too. You learn more. It is true. If you are disloyal to your friends, pretty soon you won't have any friends. If you live by knives, you'll die by knives. If you use cocaine, you're going to become an addict. You're going to destroy yourself. If you tell yourself lies, pretty soon you're going to have to tell other lies to cover up those lies, and other lies to tell other lies, and you won't even know whether you're coming or going. You will be very confused about a great many more things than you intended to be. So that there are social consequences built into the order of nature for living wrongly. There are There are intellectual consequences built in. There are bodily consequences built in. There are all kinds of consequences. And there are some people who the place you need to begin with them is in conscience. They keenly feel this. Some people really don't very much. With some people, there's such an overwhelming impression of the orderliness and the designedness of things. And you can talk about that. And you say, well, that's because there is a designer. There is somebody who made it. Some people are impressed with the fact that, take sex, for instance. Sex is for the sake of procreation and the unity of the procreative partners. They can make that makes very good sense, even to a lot of secular people. And they say, oh, yeah, well, and maybe you can begin with that there. Maybe there's somebody, but natural consequences are, so to speak, of the four witnesses, is the witness of last resort. If the other three witnesses haven't kicked in, this is the one that does. And there are many people, that's the only witness that makes sense to them. That's where you begin talking with them. But you try to broaden the focus. You try to bring in other things. Like when people say, for instance, well, I think that the reciprocity is important. I don't want to do anything that's going to get me on the outs with other people, and I shouldn't do anything that would, and nothing's wrong unless it hurts somebody. Well, people can. What do you mean by hurting? You need a pretty thick idea you need a thicker idea of morality than just don't hurt in order to know what counts as hurt and what doesn't count as hurt. Is morally corrupting somebody hurt? What if you hurt somebody but the person consented to being hurt? Would that still be hurt? What if, and is that all there is? What if I boasted that I'm such a good teacher? I don't think I've ever taught my students a single truth, but I've never hurt them by telling them something that wasn't true. Would I have grounds to boast? Because no, I wouldn't. No. I wouldn't. Would I, if I was not compassionate and tender and loving to my wife, but could I boast that I'd never hurt her by sleeping with another woman? No, that's only the skin of it. And so I think we can go further. And I think people get that. That's actually in their common sense too, but they haven't noticed it. So much of philosophy is, I'm not a Wittgensteinian, but this is a line from Wittgenstein, is assembling reminders. Assembling reminders, putting together reminders of stuff we already know, and that we either haven't thought about, or forgot about, or haven't bothered to think about, or maybe even don't want to think about. Put them together.
What are some other things that we can't not know then? Because what would that be? That would be just objective morality? Would you put it that way, or would you put it differently?
I would. There was a Thomas Aquinas says that all the Ten Commandments kinds of things are things that the reason of every man immediately leads him to recognize. And he says, it's a stupendous idea. He says, the basics, the moral basics of our, he says, the same for all, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge. That means they're not only right for everybody, but they're at some level known to everybody. And even a lot of Thomists really don't want to take him at his word. They say, oh, he just means everybody knows that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided, but they don't know anything beyond that. But he says they do. Later on, when he's talking about the divine law, he says about don't steal, honor your mother and father, don't kill. He says the mind of man immediately recognizes all these kinds of things.
So I can go with you there, but what about in a society in which fornication is promoted and celebrated, and you're raised in an MTV generation, and you believe that fornicating is acceptable? This doesn't clearly go against the direct commandment to not commit adultery, but is that something we can't not know? It seems to me that people can not realize that that's immoral.
I think it is true. I'd say that's one of the details. Some things about sex I think everybody does know. I think everybody really recognizes the wrong of being unfaithful to a spouse. On the other hand, some people have very unclear ideas about what a spouse is.
Exactly. Why does it have to be a spouse at all? That's my point. Why can't I just fornicate?
Why can't I just have a committed relationship? Yes. And of course, there isn't any commitment there. That's the whole point of not marrying.
It's commitment for now. It's commitment
for now. Yeah, right. It's easy to be a lot more confused about the details. Thomas Aquinas says that too. Right, the big ticket items enough. Everybody's clear about, but the details they aren't. It may be. Now, even there though, Most people, unless they're so far gone that their willingness to listen and to think is really coarsened. Most people, you present an argument, you say, just sleeping with woman after woman after woman, and has this actually been fulfilling to you? And I say, well, you just take what you can get, man.
Yeah, give them 3 beers and they'll say no.
There's some pain and stuff, but that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Well, could it ever be better? You point out. Did you know that men and women in marriages say that they have even not just more fulfillment in other senses, but more sexual satisfaction than unmarried people who just hook up, and it's not as big a surprise to people as you would think. They sort of know that these lives of fornication and sexual abandon are empty. It's not that they are completely ignorant here. It's that they don't want to take this to the conclusion. They don't want to connect the dots of the things that their experience is telling them because they might have to change.
I agree with what you're saying. I'm also trying to hear this through the ears of an atheist who thinks this is incredibly patronizing. Like I very much want to know the truth. It just doesn't seem clear to me that the Christian truth and its moral claims are true. Let me just push you on the 10 Commandments, right?
Yeah, okay.
So I think most of these I understand. Like even honor the Lord thy God. Depending, you could understand God in many different ways. The most sacred thing, and you shouldn't blaspheme the most sacred thing, however you understand it.
Okay.
But how can I not know or that I should honor the Sabbath? That doesn't seem to be something I can know innately.
Okay. Well, that's not one of the things that you can't not know. Here's why. Thomas Aquinas, the way he explains it is like this. There is a difference between basic principles and the things that we derive from those basic principles, right? This is an everyday thing. I know that I should have regard for the safety of my neighbors on the roads.
Yep.
But now one kind of conclusion is we're going to make a law saying that if you go 130 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone, you're going to be in trouble. Mm-hmm. Now that's by conclusion. You ought to have regard for the safety of your neighbor.
Oh, I see.
This violates safety of your neighbor, so we're going to apply this penalty. But now wait a minute. Now there's something else. Why this penalty? Maybe we could have said we'll impound your car. Maybe we'll say we'll put you in prison for 30 days.
We'll behead you.
We'll behead you. We'll cut off your gear shift hand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called determination. It's not that you're simply drawing a logical inference. This is wrong, and therefore this is wrong. It's that you're filling in the blanks. For instance, we'll punish it this way instead of this way. Or for instance, we can't have people drive any old way on the highway, but we'll have them drive on the right. There would be nothing wrong with having them drive on the left.
Australia, baby.
Okay, and that's fine in Australia.
Right.
But if I said...
But if I went back there to visit and said, well, I've become accustomed to doing it on the right.
Then it would be wrong.
Right.
Curiously, the fact of enactment makes something wrong that wouldn't have been wrong, that wasn't wrong just according to the natural law.
Say it again.
The fact that it was now forbidden by law.
Yes.
Makes driving on the wrong side wrong.
Right.
Even though if there had been no law, there wouldn't have been a wrong side. It wouldn't have been wrong.
Competent authority issuing a law in line with reason.
Can make a law which actually adds something to the natural law, which is curious. I mean, people get this wrong and they think, oh, well, if the law can make anything obligatory that wasn't obligatory before, a lawmaker can command anything that he wants to. No, he can't. There has to be a basis in the natural law for it. Now go back to the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Let's distinguish between that part of the commandment that is the basic principle and that part of the commandment that is the quote-unquote determination, the filling in the blanks, the pinning it down with details. God is first letting us know that times and places need to be set aside for the worship of God and remission of labor. Now, he could have said, do it every 3 days, do it every 8 days, do it every whatever. Do it
Sunday instead of Saturday. That would be an example,
do it every day. But But he said every 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
That was pinning it down. God could have commanded differently there. And that would have been fine. But this is what he did. So it's not to be expected that the atheist is going to understand the reason for why every 7 days. But he can understand you even if he doesn't agree with you if you say it's right that if there is a God, if he is what we say he is, what he says he is, then times and places ought to be set aside to worship him and desist from labor.
Interesting. Yeah, good point. Thank you. When it comes to different moral acts, it seems that most of us are moral objectivists or moral absolutists about everything except sex. So I don't know too many people who say everything in moderation, including racism. You know, people are pretty down on racism, as they ought to be. People aren't moral relativists when it comes to insider trading or theft. Like we all have an opinion and we think it's true. When it comes to sex, it seems like it's all now multiple choice.
It's all multiple choice.
Do you agree, and why is that the case?
Well, okay, that's several questions. First, why has this happened? I think the biggest causal influence on this was the invention of the birth control pill. People had a sort of a vague idea before that sex is connected with procreation. Okay? And that's a principle of the natural law too. Sure, the heart is for pumping blood, the mind is for deliberating and knowing the truth, anger is for arousing me to the defense of endangered good, my thumb is so that I can oppose the fingers so as to grasp, sex is for turning the wheel of the generations. But I think once upon a time that wasn't an abstract point to people because they could just see that when you have sex, there are kids. Now you invent this easy pill, and they say, oh, we've broken the natural link. We've changed our nature. Well, we haven't actually. Because when you try to evade the consequence of fertility, there are other consequences of the attempt to evade the consequences. So now we paradoxically, people said, if we only promote contraception, now that we've invented such an easy means of it, there won't be any more children out of wedlock. There are more. There are more because it changed people's attitudes. They became much more casual about sex. So it's not just that they're having sex and using pills. It's that they're now having more sex in other ways. It's like T.S. Eliot once said in the Four Quartets, one of his poetic works. He said people are dreaming of systems so perfect that no one has to be good. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So we're having this sexual catastrophe and this meltdown. Eventually, the pendulum will swing the other way. But I think it's going to take longer. And there's going to be, a lot more damage before the pendulum swings back. Because in previous days, all right, you become sexually immoral on a widespread basis. And you have all these kids born out of the wedlock, and society is going to pieces. But the invention of this new technology has convinced us that we can keep that kind of thing from happening, even though the evidence is in front of us that it isn't. And so it's like pushing that pendulum up, holding it back so that it can't swing back. And eventually the pendulum gets so heavy that it sweeps back with enormous force and smashes things. I would not be surprised if it's going to take that kind of a smash before it swings back this time. I hope not. I hope not, and that's why we have to talk to people still and persuade them. But I think that, this is what's going on, and yet people can, if you talk to people, people can understand this. At the University of Virginia, there are a lot of family sociologists at my own university. A fellow named Mark Regnerus are studying things about this, and 2 generations ago, some family sociologists were saying, well, if marriages break up and the kid and the parents marry new people or don't marry, the kids will be just as well off.
Yeah. They're resilient is what we told ourselves.
And they're going to be resilient. Yes, they're going to be children are so resilient. It turns out not to be true. The children are wrecked. And they're also less able to form their own marital bonds. They're more disillusioned about it. And eventually the data collects, or the fact that if you've had sexual experience before marriage, you're much less likely to be faithful. Mm-hmm. If you've lived together, cohabited, even if it's the only person you ever had sex with, you cohabit before marriage. People think this is practice for marriage. It's more like practice for divorce, because it's practice in living without a commitment. and pretending that you have one. Once in class, I wasn't teaching about sex, but I was teaching something about Plato. And, Plato is all interested in sex, of course, so the sex comes up. And I had learned that if I just lay something on the students, they're not going to appreciate this. And so I said, and this is truthful, I said, I have a lot of compassion for your generation because, my generation invented the sexual revolution. And it was so new that they escaped some of the consequences. And I have a feeling that your generation is paying the price for the dinner that we ordered.
I feel this way when I watch that old show Seinfeld.
Yeah.
I can't watch it without feeling sad because it seems like they're still running off the fumes of a Christian society in which, Jerry's parents are still together. They have uncles and aunts. There's still some kind of Christian bedrock there, but they're spending the inheritance and we're kind of a result of that. And so when I watch Seinfeld, it's very difficult for me to find those sexual jokes and interplays.
I know humorous. Some of the stuff is funny, and some of it just makes you want to. You say, "Wait, shouldn't I be weeping here?"
Yeah.
Anyway, when I said this in class, a student said, "I know exactly what you mean." I think I was expecting some pushback, but that's not what happened. He said, "I know exactly what you mean." He said, "My parents divorced and they split. And I love them. And I really think the world of them." He said, "And I want more than anything else to fall in love with a woman and marry her and be faithful to her forever." But he said, "But I don't think it's possible."
Mm-hmm.
Because, and you see, he thought his parents were so wonderful, he thought if they couldn't do it, nobody can. They didn't think that they were doing this to him by splitting. But they were. People think that breaking up is an exit. Look, there are some times that people have to separate. The guy's beating you or something. Okay, I understand that. But people think, well, it's just not working out. And they think there's a back door. And sometimes the only way that you can heal what's damaged in your marriage is to close the back door and get serious.
Yeah.
And then you find out, well, hey, we can make this work.
When you were an atheist professor at the University of, what is it, Texas?
Texas,
in Austin,
University of Texas at Austin.
I mean, could you have imagined back then if somebody said in 2022 there'd be these fellas cutting off their Johnson and calling themselves women and competing against women and dominating them, and that we'd all celebrate and be told to clap and pretend that this was good and liberating?
I didn't imagine it.
Would you have had a problem with it?
But if somebody, well, there's two different senses of having a problem.
Yeah.
There was enough inherited moral residue, even though I told myself that there was no objective good and evil, that a lot of things distressed me. And if somebody had said this to me, I would have been distressed. But I also would have said, but there is no objective reason to object to it. And this is just my distress. I had this sort of a nonsense of a relativism of virtues, that there might be moral communities, coalitions of people who have this interpretation of the virtues, and coalitions of people who have this interpretation of the virtues, and they might really be at war with each other unless you can find some place that they intersect. And I tried to work out a sort of a new sociology based on that kind of thing. And so yes, I could imagine genocides and all kinds of things, and they may have distressed me, but that was different than saying, and I can tell you what's wrong with it.
Yeah. Where do you see this going then? Because
what's this?
The sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. The effects of the.
I see the crash.
Is it crashing now? Because this transgenderism stuff is a relatively new thing. Where else are we going before?
Well, yeah, but it is an aspect of the crash. I mean, look, if you can't even tell if you're a man or a woman anymore,
or what a man or woman is,
imagine we've now reached a point in which people can aspire to the highest offices in the land and say, but I don't know what a man and a woman is. This is flabbergasting. It is flabbergasting. By the way, I think that one has to talk about this with compassion. I understand that people are confused about this. They are confused about who they are, about what they are, and they're in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And they imagine that if I'd only if I only get this cut off, if I only have this sewed on, if I only start dressing this way, if I start presenting as a woman or presenting as a man and convince myself that that's what I am, I will be happy. And what the research shows is that no, they aren't happy. All the problems that they had before persist. Sometimes they're worse. Sometimes they're worse. Sometimes then they say, how could I have done this to myself?
I think that's a good point. We have to distinguish the anger we rightly feel at the propaganda being directed at us from big government and Hollywood and big tech, and then distinguish that from the suffering people who are confused because they live in a broken sexual society.
The most conspicuous thing that I see when I look at the sexual landscape is suffering. You mentioned to me before we began talking for the recording that you'd read my book on the meaning of sex. And so you know that at the beginning I said that's the principal reason I wrote this. There's this landscape of unutterable beauty shot through with the most unspeakable pain. And I see the next generation coming over the hill, walking right into that. And we haven't done them any favors with what with the kind of world that we've prepared for them. I want it to be better for them. I don't want them to have to suffer that kind of pain. So anger isn't the deal here. Anger for the propagandizers, yes. Anger for the people at the bottom of this who are believing lies and even lies about themselves and suffering, no.
Compassion. And truth. There's an idea some people have that it's more compassionate to let them believe lies, and I don't think that's true. I think the only love is united with truth, and the only truth has to be united with love. How are you still employed at the University of Texas in Austin? Maybe after this video you won't be.
Well, actually after this video I probably still will be, because things like you and me doing this are just flying under the radar. Most of my colleagues, they just say, oh, he does this Thomas Aquinas stuff, and so he gets books published about that by reputable publishers, so that's good. But of course, that it's all that religious stuff, and it's crazy. and so I write a book on how to stay Christian in college, and this and that, and I doubt that any of my presently retired colleagues know that. I have gotten into trouble from time to time, not as bad as some of my colleagues have. But I'm also very careful. For instance, a student may come into my office. Office door is open. Keep it open. Don't close it. A student may be crying. Say, I've got to tell you about this. Can I close the door? I'll say, I'm really sorry. Because of the legal situation at the University of Texas, I can't let you close the door. But we can keep people away from the proximity of the door. You can sit wherever you want in the room, and we can keep our voices down. And there's nobody out there right now, but I won't close the door. You don't know, people's ideas can change because they're suffering. They might project it onto you and say things about you that didn't happen. I want that door open. I want to tell them, you sit wherever you. They'll say, where should I sit? I say, wherever you want to, so that they can't say I trapped them. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
He trapped me and made me talk about things I didn't want to talk about.
When I travel and speak, it's in my contract that I won't be alone in a car with a woman. Not Smart. Because I'm afraid that I'm going to, do anything inappropriate. Not at all. But it's unfortunate that
people consider that crazy.
They do.
But it's not. We're not crazy on the subject of women. The culture is crazy about this kind of thing, and because nothing is considered wrong sexually anymore. It's all a matter of what you perceive as troublesome, right. Which can mean anything. It's the broader culture that created that problem. We're just being protective. Or I can teach about Thomas Aquinas in a class, along with other figures. Aristotle, who was a pagan, for goodness sake, and John Locke, who's a sort of a revisionist, and all kinds of people like that. I can teach things like that, because they're part of the canon. It would be harder at some universities where even teaching the canon is considered wicked, because they're all old, dead, white European guys. And although Aristotle was born in Stagira, which is part of Asia, but I remind people of that. So all right, I can teach it, and then if a student, and if I'll say this is what he says about God. You have to. You're studying him. Or if I don't bring up God in some class, a student may. I'll be teaching a course about the American founding, and a student will say, "Did these guys believe in God?" Some of my professors say, "No, they didn't. They were all skeptics and deists." And I say, "Well, as a matter of fact, that's false. There were a pile of skeptics and deists, but the majority of them were Christians, probably most of them Calvinists." And we can talk about that. I'm answering their question, so it's hard to get in trouble for that. In some ways, it's easier to talk about some of those things than it used to be because there's been a rise of atheism, yes, but there's also been a frustration with the aridity and emptiness of that, and people want to hear about this. Once after a class on natural law, and again, I'll be very careful about sex, I will, even about using it to illustrate a point about natural teleology, about natural things having purposes, mm-hmm. I will usually wait for a student to ask, okay? Well, one day that did happen, and a student asked some question, and I gave very quickly the rational basis for natural law of sexual morality. You can see that polygamy, for instance, undermines the union between the husband and the wife. It undermines it creates jealousy among the wives. It causes jealousy among the children of different mothers with the same father. It's undermining. It attenuates the relationship between the father and the child. So it's undermining the procreative good. It's undermining also the unitive good. People can see that. A guy came up to me after class, a student. He said, "Gee, I want to thank you for that." He said, "I've been told all my life that all this stuff was just a bunch of arbitrary taboos with no rational foundation, and I never knew that there was a rational foundation." Now, I don't know if I convinced him. That's almost not important, because the possibility of a rational foundation, his eyes had been open to that. Now, it isn't always peaceful like that. Once there was another time, it was actually in that same class, that same semester, I think, a young man asked a question. I hate questions like this. They say, "Well, what about this?" and he mentions something perverse. I've learned to give them the premises for answering the question, but not to answer the question.
Okay, show us how that worked.
Well, I said, well, okay, this is a sexual practice that you're talking about. Would you say that? What do you think that the power to ingest food is for? Well, nutrition. Okay, so if I eat a lot of food and then induce vomiting so that I can eat some more and have some more pleasure, would that be good? Now they say, no, it's disgusting. I say, okay, we're thinking about all of our powers that way. The mind isn't for planning bank robberies, it's for deliberating and finding out the truth. Anger shouldn't be intemperate, it's for defending endangered goods. Everything's for something. What are the purposes of the sexual powers then? Well,
that's the one thing. There's no purpose.
Well, some of them will say pleasure.
Yeah.
But if I start out, but this is curious too. If you ask somebody what's the purpose of the sexual powers, they all say pleasure. If you say, what's the purpose of the eye? Seeing. What's the purpose of the heart? Pumping
right.
blood. What's the purpose of the thumb? Well,
don't these things bring pleasure?
Then, yeah, they do all give pleasure.
Yeah.
The exercise of every single voluntary power gives pleasure.
That's right.
And then if you ask them, what's the purpose of the sexual powers? They say procreation. Or at least they say,
see,
or at
yeah.
least, you see what I mean? They're primed.
You
They're
set
primed.
the stage.
They get it. They see it for themselves. And I say, okay, that's part of the picture. Usually they say reproduction, and I say reproduction, a guppy reproduces, we procreate. We're inducing, we're not only bringing about conception, we're raising these children, we're doing all these things together, introducing them into adult life, into being virtuous people. That's procreation. And I say, okay, what's the other thing it's about? There's another thing? I say, well, do we reproduce like guppies? No, we don't.
What's a guppy?
Oh, it's a little fish.
Okay.
It's a little fish. People who raise tropical fish sometimes they're very small. And the thing about guppies is that the mother guppy and the father guppy don't know each other. They don't know the children. She spews some eggs into the water. He spews the sperm into the water, and fertilization takes place without any connection between the two of them. Then the little guppies get born, and And if you're not careful and you're not feeding your guppies well enough, the parents will eat the children. Okay? It's not personal. We're not like that. Our mode of procreation requires an intimate, enduring partnership between the man and the woman. Not just to conceive the children, but to raise the children, to teach the children, to even after we're no longer fertile and we're helping our children to establish their own new families, our procreative role continues. So people get this. So I say, okay, now about that practice that you mentioned. Apply that. And the guy will say, well, it isn't procreative. I'll say, okay. I guess it isn't binding anybody together either. All right. So what would the natural law conclusion be about that? I guess that would be wrong. Now, so that came up in one class. And I was very pleased with myself that without having to give the answer directly, I'd led them through this reasoning. Sometimes I do have to give it, but I'd led them through the reasoning. And a young woman in the front row starts crying.
So like sobbing or gently crying?
Sobbing, not screaming crying, but, sobbing. And I say, are you all right? And she says, it's just that this is so cruel. I said, cruel to who? And she meant to people of certain dispositions to perform certain acts. And I said, well, let's think about that. She's still crying. I said, if this is true, now you're free to tell me why you think it isn't true. But if this is true, then the most compassionate thing that you could tell somebody who is living in defiance of it is, you're hurting yourself. The way you're living, the way you're behaving, is not good for you. If somebody was addicting himself to drugs, it would be compassion. It wouldn't be to tell him, stop using that stuff. It wouldn't be cruel to tell him, don't stop using that stuff. Well, she was oblivious to that and kept sobbing. I came to realize in that particular case that this was probably partly self-referential. She felt accused, even though I'd accused nobody. And I said, this isn't even about judgment. We're not saying who's to blame or who's done wrong or sinned. All I've talked about is what's for our well-being. And another part of it, besides being self-referential, was that she was using her own sorrow, which was real. I have no doubt about that. She was using it strategically. I've seen other situations where people use sorrow strategically. A woman started screaming once at the definition of a certain type of abortion. It was she was in pain. I'm pretty sure she was post-abortive, but it was a way of changing the focus and throwing something on me. That was a bizarre sort of experience. I wasn't even teaching about abortion in the class. It was just, I was teaching a class about the American founders. And, they thought that there were three motives that are very important in political action. There's passion, which they thought of as wild, unregulated emotion, bad stuff. There's interest, self-interest. Well, that's bad too, but you can channel it maybe with the appropriate incentives and checks and balances. And then there's virtue. That's good, but there's not enough of it. And so they had ways to make the most of what's the best and to try to block the expression of passion and all that kind of stuff, delay decision until passion subsides. And I wanted to explain this, and I said, so can you give me an example of a political issue that arouses passion in our day? But this was an 8 o'clock class, and everybody was groggy. I've learned not to teach at 8 o'clock.
At night or morning?
In the morning.
Yeah, people are tired.
At 8 o'clock at night, people are
also
more awake.
Maybe.
They're groggy too, but not as groggy as at 8. And they're sort of going, I don't know. And I said, okay, I know it's 8 o'clock. Shall I tell you about an issue that's been arousing a lot of passion lately? A lot of controversy. Yeah, please. I said, Congress is debating partial birth abortion. This was years ago. And they got puzzled looks. I said, do you know what that is? No. Do you want me to tell you what it is? So I gave a one sentence, purely clinical, not emotional, not value loaded, not morally biased description of just the technique. That's when the woman starts screaming. And it took me a couple of seconds to even realize that it was an articulate scream. There were words in it.
Oh, wow.
She was screaming that it's only done to save the mother's life. And I said, well, As a matter of fact, that's not true. One person did testify before Congress that that was the only reason he ever used it, but he admitted afterward that he'd perjured himself. She started screaming louder. Now, here's what showed me that was strategic. I have no doubt that she was really in pain, but she was using her pain strategically. I turned to the class and I said, well, do you see now why the founders were concerned about passion in politics? She turned off like a light switch. From high decibel screaming to instant silence. Just like that. The ploy hadn't worked. It had worked against her.
It probably worked at helping people be less groggy.
It sure did.
Everybody up. You could maybe
it
bring
sure
her in
did.
to other
Yeah.
classes.
Some students were asking me afterward that they said after class they said
better than coffee.
that was really cool. Did you rehearse that with her ahead of time?
No.
So, you think weird things happen in the classroom. And you can get shut down sometimes. You can be made a target.
Do you have tenure?
Yes, I do.
What does that really mean today? Like, if you don't mind me asking, what would it take for you to be let go in these sort of culture wars and these very difficult issues?
It would be almost impossible to fire me if I have tenure. Many conservatives think that since crazy people get tenure, if only you abolish tenure, there won't be crazy people anymore. They misunderstand how universities work. If tenure were abolished, it would be the crazy people who were deciding whether you should be fired.
Mm-hmm.
So I might very well be gone, but it would be very difficult to get rid of me if I was walking in drunk every day. They could. Mm-hmm. There used to be moral turpitude clauses in tenure contracts, but nobody believes in moral turpitude anymore.
What does that mean?
Extreme moral corruption. Okay? You can get in trouble for sleeping with your students or something, but even there, they probably wouldn't fire you.
Wow.
They'd discipline you in some other way. I don't know. Having not had any experience of sleeping with my students, I'm not certain about that one.
Good.
But
when you became a Christian, how did your fellows react? How did your fellow academics react to that?
Most of them were not aware of it, but those who were aware of it were alarmed by it.
Because they knew how you were prior?
Yeah, it was okay that I had been a nihilist and I was hired. There had been some controversy going on in the department about whether to hire people who use decision methods borrowed from economics to understand how politicians act. Mm-hmm. And some people had thought that I was going to be one of those people being hired. And they heard me spouting all this nihilistic philosophy instead and thought, he's not one of those.
Right.
So they hired me. But now... And that kind of craziness is just such, it's there in academia, people just take it for granted, so they could live with that. But when I became a Christian, those who did know about it found it disturbing, found it alarming. Because see, the idea is that faith, that academia is supposed to be about reason, right? Mm-hmm. And that faith is something inimical to reason. Mm-hmm. No, that's not how we see it, right? Mm-hmm, we think that faith and reason are the two wings of the bird. It needs them both to fly. Faith actually enlarges the possibilities of reason, but hardly anybody understands that.
Well, help us understand it.
Well, sure. All right, think about it. It can actually be worked out by reason that there is a God. There are all kinds of arguments, and not just the famous 5 ways. There are all kinds of arguments for the existence of God, some of them more compelling than others, some of them extremely compelling, very persuasive. And you can do more than that. By reason, without even faith, without revelation, you can work out a lot of what God's qualities would have to be. He'd have to be powerful. He'd have to be
immaterial.
Good. He'd have to be immaterial. He would have been the creator of matter. He would have been, there'd be all these other things. He would not be composed of parts. Mm-hmm. You can work out all these things. But there are a lot of the other things that you might be able to get a hunch about or develop a probable argument for, but that you couldn't know for sure. Like this. We're messed up. If he's good, even our understanding of goodness likely comes from him. And we can see that we don't measure up to it. Can we be fixed? Do we need to be forgiven? Could that happen? Well, if he's good, maybe all that could happen. You've got, at best, though, a probable argument you don't know. We need this God to speak to us. Revelation says he has spoken to you. Now you've got new data. Now you've got new data about how this breach between you and him can be healed, about the grace that he offers for the healing of this. And Revelation itself is not irrational. It's not reasonable like a theorem on the blackboard is, that you can prove, well, and therefore Jesus rose from the dead. But you think about it, it's reasonable to believe that it's necessary. It's reasonable to believe that it's possible. A God who is all-powerful could certainly disclose himself to us. Mm-hmm. It's reasonable to believe. It's reasonable to believe a lot of other things about it. It's even reasonable to believe that it's authentic because it's testified to by some extraordinary events, and that were witnessed by many people. Atheists sometimes say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but then they say but then when you say, well, here's some extraordinary evidence, there was a miracle, then they rule out the extraordinary evidence. So I think that's bait and switch. It's changing the rules on you. Okay, so it's reasonable to believe that it's authentic, and it's even reasonable to believe that it's confirmed, because your life changes. Faith is, there's a doorway here. Grace can start pouring into you.
I want to go back, if you don't mind. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and you said, well, here's a miracle. But the problem is the people who are assessing the miracle are presumably not there when the miracle occurs.
Sure.
So the atheist is still saying, yes, that's the extraordinary claim. I need extraordinary evidence for.
Okay, well, in that case, they should say I won't believe in the Great Wall of China unless I've been there and seen it with my own eyes. I won't believe that Julius Caesar existed unless I was there and saw it with my own eyes. My gosh, that was a couple of thousand years ago, or almost a couple of thousand years ago. Why should I believe that there was a Roman Empire?
Because these things are clearly not in the same realm of someone rising from the dead.
Well, look, we have actually better attestation to the events in the life of Jesus than we do to the events in the life of Julius Caesar.
Yeah, but what we're claiming, one is clearly something outside of our ordinary experience. One is at least could happen.
Notice that's begging the question. One at least could happen.
Very good.
Oh, wait a minute. We're supposed to be finding out whether you could rise from the dead.
Very
now
good.
You're saying we shouldn't accept any evidence for the rising from the dead because we already know it couldn't happen?
Excellent.
That's
well done.
That's begging the question.
Checkmate.
Yeah.
That's right. If God exists, then all of a sudden the resurrection of somebody becomes possible.
So the question is, well, did it happen? I concede that such a rare thing as this is going to require lots of evidences and things, but it's not unreasonable. For one thing, it isn't as though the disciples were expecting a resurrection. They weren't even expecting a death. They were shattered. One of them, Thomas, they tell him about it. We've seen the Lord. We've seen the Lord. He says, I'm not going to believe. He talks just like an atheist. He says, I'm not going to believe it unless I see it. I'm going to have to put my fingers in the wounds. Maybe then I'll believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
He wants extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, that was pretty darned extraordinary evidence. So the conversion of people who were in utter despair at the crumbling of their world, there's the fact that alternative explanations don't really match.
Yeah.
You have to believe that the empty tomb, well, wait, Roman guards were posted to guard it. What did they do? If somebody paid them off, hey, let us go in here and take away the body. Roman guards got killed for that. That was the judicial punishment. Discipline was very harsh. Well, maybe yes, he didn't rise from the dead, but he had been in a coma, and now he appears to them. He appeared to have great vigor. He didn't seem like somebody who's
someone who's about to die and needs medical
right?
attention isn't going to inspire the sort of hope the resurrected Lord did.
And Paul talks about this as in one of his letters as though it's a matter that everybody knows. And he was seen by these, and he was seen by these, and he was seen by the 12, and he was seen by this. And on one occasion, he was seen by more than 200 people. And he doesn't say, oh, and by the way, let me prove that, because he knows that this is within the lifetime of the witnesses. Everybody knows about this. You can check him on this. They already know. So I don't think it's unreasonable. The only reason that you would block out this evidence, and there are other extraordinary occasions. Physicists, use extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims all the time. There are these little things that are too small for us to see, and they're sort of waves and they're sort of particles, but they're not exactly either one. Or what's going on here? Space is curved. These are pretty extraordinary claims, and they're even about invisible things. But we concede that inferences can be made. Mm-hmm. Argument to the best explanation. What's the best explanation of it? I can't prove it like the same way that I prove a theorem. Premise, only possible conclusion. But I can say this explanation accounts for all the facts. Mm-hmm. Better than the alternative explanations do.
So when you came back to Christ, did you have this newfound passion that many converts have, and did you desire to then help your students see the truth of Christianity? Or
that didn't happen for about another 2 years. I mean, I was in a period of convalescence, you might say, intellectual convalescence for a long time, which was, it was like living it was as though I'd been living in a dark attic, and somebody came in and started throwing back the shutters. The shafts of light coming in, I could almost feel them. It was almost a tactile experience. Memories of things I'd forgotten, whole categories of reasoning that I'd forgotten how to do, wow. Coming back. And this took some time, but then at the end of it, I'm thinking one day, and I'd gotten over the desperation of thinking I've wrecked myself and he can't do anything with me. Okay. But what is he supposed to do with me? I'm not here for nothing. And I will credit my Protestant upbringing. My Baptist forebears were very big on evangelism. And I thought, am I supposed to be telling my students about Christ? I was in my office and I prayed. I said, God, I can't just lay it on them.
Yeah.
It's going to be rejected and I'll just get fired and nobody will believe it. But if I don't know how to do this, if you want me to talk to my students about you, you're going to have to send them to me. Well, you know what they say, be careful what you pray for. This had never happened before. And that week, 3 students came to my office hours with questions that amounted to this: can we talk about God? It's the funniest thing. It's the funniest thing. A student in one of my ethics courses, he'd been reading Aristotle. He was an older returning student. He's a very dramatic guy. He came to my office door. He said, Professor, yeah, I got to talk to you. Well, okay, what do we got to talk about? He said, you're scaring me. I said, well, you better come in and sit down. How am I scaring you? He said, well, it's not really you. It's this Aristotle guy that you're making us read. I said, well, how is Aristotle scaring you? He said, well, in this book of his that you're making us read, he keeps talking about virtue. And it's making me realize I haven't led a virtuous life. And he holds out his hand, and it was really shaking. Okay? Now, he was a melodramatic guy, but I believed him. And it was striking because Aristotle hadn't talked about sin, he hadn't talked about judgment, he hadn't talked about God, he hadn't talked about conscience, he hadn't talked about any of these things. He just said there are these virtues, you have to have them to live a flourishing life, So where was he getting this sudden conviction of sin? That's how John's gospel calls it that. I hadn't known that the Holy Spirit could use an old pagan philosopher to bring about the conviction of sin. And so, doors open up to talk about things all the time.
Before we move on to the subject of happiness, which I'm looking forward to talking about, what advice would you give to those watching, maybe parents who are about to send their teens off to college, or those who are in college? How do you stay Catholic in college?
Well, I think one thing that you want to do is, if you're a parent, is prepare your kids very well. We used to assume that the culture was Christian, or that the culture was at least Christian friendly. That's no longer true anymore. We used to assume, I'll go to the school. When I was a kid, for goodness sake, in most of my grades in elementary school, the teachers said grace with us before we sat down to lunch. This was the public school.
Yeah.
When John F. Kennedy was shot, my wife's teacher led the class in a rosary.
Wow! Wow!
Yeah,
at a public school.
In a public school, you couldn't imagine that now. And so they thought, well, the whole culture is cooperating with us in teaching this, and they go to church, and it's all going to make sense to them. That's not true. We're now the counterculture. So you have to do a couple of things. You have to not frighten your children, but make them aware that we are the counterculture, and that a lot of things in the culture are not good, and they're against this, so that they can listen with a grain of salt. We don't want them all to be disrespecting their teachers, but their teacher says something crazy. We want them to recognize there's something crazy here, instead of thinking teacher said it must be true. And then you have to prepare them. Don't expect the school to teach them anything about God. You can't even always expect the church to teach them a whole lot. A lot of times we get together young people for what we call fellowship and think somehow that's going to do it. No. Or we teach them about the Bible stories when they're very small children, and then that's the last serious instruction they get. And when they start asking more adult questions when they're teens, we aren't answering them. Well, you have to start answering them as parents. If you don't know the answers, you need to start reading and learning the answers. You have to take your faith, the intellectual side of your faith, more seriously. Have deep conversations about this with your kids. They will talk with you if you're open with them. They want to talk about this stuff. They'll bring it up, and don't be afraid. Make your kids go to church. Don't think, oh, I can't force them; they'll go away. They're much more likely to go away if they haven't.
Yeah,
they may appreciate being forced to later on.
So, what if someone's about to enter college and they have a basic prayer life and they do believe in God?
I would say, well, okay.
What do you say to them
when you get to college? This is what I tell young people themselves, and I wrote a book called "How to Stay Christian in College." This is the first thing I suggest. There's no such thing as a solitary Christian. This is a mistake that is less often made by Catholics than by Protestants, but it's made by a lot of Catholics too. You think, well, it's just you and me, God. I can pray without going to church. I can worship you without doing it with other people. I can just do all this kind of stuff. No, you can't. You take a coal out of a coal fire and you put it out on the hearth, and it's going to go out. Well, that's how it is with our faith. Every kind of community life is like this.
Right.
It's not just as though there's something weird about faith. We are
That's a good point.
Each other's reference group.
Yeah.
And we need to take that seriously. Hang out with people of the faith, and be careful of your companions. Look for a Christian fellowship group on campus
to get plugged into.
Get plugged into, and not just that, but also a real church off campus, because that Christian fellowship group, everybody there is just like you. They're students, they're about the same age. I mean, maybe not identical to you in personality and interest, but you know what I mean. But you need to be around other kinds of Christians. Old geezers like me, mothers and fathers with children, the children themselves. St. Paul says that we're all members of the body of Christ. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to have a Christian fellowship group on campus. That's great, but it's like all the elbows are getting together, or all the navels, or all of the noses. Yeah. No, they need to be part of a real church too. In the Christian fellowship group, they can discuss those things that come up, and that challenge them in their college or university experience. But and talk about those things that they're in the middle of. But in the church, they're getting to be part of the body of Christ. That also reduces the shock if they've had a good Christian fellowship group on campus, and then they graduate, and now they're not college students anymore, and they go someplace and they don't have one, and they feel like everything's over, and they don't even know how to be part of a congregation. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing that I tell them, and talk with people. This kind of conversation that we're having. Talk with your friends. Ask them questions. Learn from them. Learn with them.
I think one thing that's so great about the podcast world we live in now is that people may be in a secular, postmodern sort of environment, but they can plug in and listen to content that helps them understand the faith.
Yes, they
and feel
can.
less alone in their
Yes, they
faith
can.
life.
And there are all kinds of exciting things that are happening now.
Yeah.
The Dominican House of Studies in D.C. has established the Thomistic Institute.
Yeah, get them.
It's spread like wildfire. There are chapters all over the place, including at my own University of Texas. Yes, they bring in speakers. They get assistants to do this. They have serious conversations with each other. In ours is working with the University Catholic Center and sometimes co-sponsor speakers and things like that. It's great, and you talk to these kids. They're thriving in their spiritual life. They're giving each other support.
Have you heard of the prayer app called Hallow?
I heard of it once, but I don't know anything about it.
I want to let you and our listeners know about it because it's fantastic. The guy who started it was kind of Buddhist leading and was listening to these New Age apps that would help him meditate. But when he converted to Catholicism, he was shocked that there was nothing like that for Catholics.
Oh, gosh.
So he creates this app that's even better, in my estimation, to the really, I'm sure it cost a lot of money to put this other app together. Hallow, Hallow. It'll lead you through the rosary. I had a guy who was an Antifa member in England. He was imprisoned for some far left extremism.
Wow.
He started listening to this show, heard me talk about Hallow, started learning how to pray the rosary on that app, and he just came into the Catholic Church this Christmas.
That's fascinating.
So just real quick, hallow.com/Matt Fradd. This is an ad read if you didn't get it.
Hallow.com/Matt Fradd.
The transition was too seamless.
It was too seamless. It shocked everybody. Hallow, HALLOW.com/Matt Fradd. People need to, and I'm sure one day I'll advertise somebody that I don't personally use, and I'm fine with that, but I really do use this. I used it last night. They even have sleep stories of people reading scripture. Scott Hahn reads like Romans for like 40 minutes with his deep, gravelly voice. So people should check that out. If they go to hallow.com/Matt Fradd and sign up online, I believe they get a month or more for free if they just download the app without going to hallow.com/Matt Fradd. Some things are available, but not the whole thing. So click the link in the description below. Hallow. But I really would recommend it. Do you use a smartphone?
I use it for some things.
I mean, I suppose you want to kind of graduate beyond having an electronic voice sort of lead you in prayers, of course.
Sure.
But it's, for someone who's like,
no, I don't think this is a problem. I mean, when I was a new Catholic learning the Rosary, it may sound silly to be praying the Rosary with a text app on your cell phone, but I was doing that.
Oh, really?
Sure, because look, I'm not a person.
How old were you? What year was this when you converted to Catholicism?
2004.
Oh, wow. I had no idea it was that recent.
Oh, yeah. I returned to Christianity in the early 80s, but it was a long time before I became Catholic. And I'm not a person who memorizes things easily. Languages come difficult to me, and this was very helpful. Yeah, it was great.
So, and yet you were teaching Thomas from the 80s on, and that wasn't enough to get you in right away, despite the fact that you loved him.
I thought I was in a denomination that prides itself as being a sort of a middle way. And I was under the delusion until the whole thing started melting down that it was possible to have one foot in the Reformation and one foot in Catholicism.
Yeah.
And it was, although it was helpful to be in a denomination that was melting down because it made me rethink my ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Christ had said the gates of hell will not prevail against his church, and they sure appeared to be prevailing here. So where is the church? What would it have to look like? And that started the process.
Okay.
A lot of people they become persuaded. Okay, I guess that's okay about Mary. I guess that's okay about the saints. I guess that's okay about the Pope. I guess that's okay.
Yeah.
And then the last thing of all that they accept is authority.
Uh-huh.
So, but for me, because of what was going on around me, authority was the first thing. And then that means that if I had any objections to certain Catholic doctrines, I had to think, if I believe that the true church would have authority, and there's nothing else around that looks like the true church, then it looks like with these things that I have objections to, it's probably me that's wrong. Maybe I better think about those things some more.
Wow. Talk about the diametrically opposed to what you said earlier about pride leading you to nihilism. Now here you are having to humble yourself, recognizing, well, I must be wrong.
Well, I've never gained anything from pride. I've only gained ruin from pride, and humility is great. There's the old Puritan John Bunyan in his Pilgrim's Progress There are some things in there that aren't great.
I still have to read that. I keep getting told.
Good. There are some things in there that aren't great. I mean, he depicts the Pope as a wild beast in a cage and all this kind of stuff.
But, didn't know that.
But that there are some things that are really great. He talks, the Pilgrim on his allegorical journey, lives for a while in the sweet valley of humiliation.
That's nice.
Isn't it? It is great.
Yeah. I was thinking of a line having to do with conversion, right? Sometimes we get to this point where we feel like we have to make a choice. We're not in a position to remain neutral. And I was thinking of that line from, who wrote A Severe Mercy? Van Ocken. And he says, between the probable and proved, there yawns a gap. Afraid to jump, we stand absurd, and see behind us sink the ground, and worse, our very standpoint crumbling, desperate dawns, our only hope to leap into the word which opens up the shuttered universe.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that beautiful?
It is beautiful. Well, that's nicely put, between the probable and the proven, because faith is not unreasonable. It's very reasonable in all these ways, but it's not a proof like in geometry and trigonometry. And so there is still an act of trust. It won't compel you. It won't compel you. There is still an act of trust. And we need God's grace for that. Yeah.
I am a big fan. I do think Pascal's wager is an excellent argument for those who think that the evidence for atheism and Christianity are equal.
Well, I think it's I am less persuaded. I think Pascal's wager is pretty good. It's pretty useful for getting people to take the decision seriously, because often they think I don't really have to make a decision. And the way he sets up the problem, there's infinite gain this way, infinite loss this way. And it sort of shocks people to the realization, wait a minute, that is what I'm talking about.
You don't think it's a good argument? I mean, people often mistake it for an argument for God's existence, which it isn't, but it is an argument for belief. Again, I think you have to add that qualifier if the evidence on both sides is equal. And I just don't know how to make a choice, and it seems that both are equally plausible. What should I do?
Well, I guess maybe it does work for some people. It just never really worked for me. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah.
And I think he's right that this is a safer way to jump, but can you jump just because on the odds there's greater gain here?
Well,
can you start to believe just because if it were true, there'd be greater gain in believing it?
Yeah, maybe not.
I'm not sure.
But he sort of responds to that shortly after, where he says, do the things that Christians do.
Now
use holy water, frequent the sacraments, say your prayers.
I'm with you there.
And the thing is,
this is something Benedict said too. It's a lot of people. I didn't realize that Pascal had said this right afterward, because I think that's absolutely. I think it's
right after. It's somewhere in the Ponce.
Because I think that's absolutely true. And people will say, well, I just don't know if this is true. And I said, well, look, why don't you do this hypothetically? Start worshiping as though you believed it. Start praying to God as though you thought he was there. You don't know he's not.
And here's the thing. If the objection is, wouldn't that be hypocritical? The answer seems to be, if God doesn't exist, why think hypocrisy is an objective wrong?
Good. That's very good. I'll remember that one. I would have had a more elaborate answer, but I like that. And I say, and just look, you can say like I did, I think I'm talking to the wall, but if you're there, okay,
yeah, that's honest.
Here we go. That's honest. It's not hypocritical. And see what happens. I think the sticking point there is people think, well, I could pray, I could go to church, but you have to start living according to the Christian moral code too.
That's actually what converted my sister. I came back from Rome at World Youth Day in the year 2000, went an agnostic, came back one of those Catholics so happy it makes you sick.
Wow. Why did you go to World Youth Day?
It was a free trip to Italy.
Oh, okay.
My mom came home from Mass. I'd stopped going. She said, do you want to go to Rome? I thought it was a trick question. I was afraid that maybe Rome was an obscure town in South Australia, population 52 or something. So I clarified. She said in Italy. I said, yes, please. And so I went thinking I was really intelligent. But for the first time in my life, I encountered Christians who genuinely believed these things and weren't weird, but they were joyful. And I was very curious. And I prayed the same prayer you did, that skeptical prayer. Lord, if you exist. You probably don't. I'm probably speaking to myself right now, and that's embarrassing, but not nearly as embarrassing as living this life as if you didn't when you do. not to mention what might come after. Therefore, let's give it a bash.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But
that makes
just
sense to
real
me.
quick, the point is with my sister, she had remained an atheist and became even more entrenched because atheism was becoming somewhat fashionable.
Mm-hmm.
And God bless her, she came and lived with my wife and I in Ireland, and her and I would go at it back and forth, about arguments for and against. And one of the things I said to her is like, well, you should, if you've been engaged in serious sin, I have no right to know about it, not asking you to tell me, but you need to repent of those things. And she said, well, I don't ever know if they're wrong. But it seems to me that trying to intellectually convert without converting morally is maybe not to convert at all. So maybe repent of those things.
You can at least be willing to repent, and in the meantime desist from doing them.
Okay, fair enough.
Show me that this is wrong. In the meantime, while waiting, I'm desisting.
So a grace was given to her where she went to confession, still not really believing in God, and confessed these things. And she came up to me shortly after and went, I think I want to get maybe a rosary. Oh my gosh. I had to hold all the passion back. I'm like, we are going to get you a 24-karat rosary and a Bible and what do you need? Let's do this thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautiful to see when people wake up like that. It shows you that, what does Paul say? I actually am asking. I forget where he says something like, I planted...
Apollos... He was talking about Apollos.
See,
one of them planted the seed, one of them
one
of them watered it, and one of them will be able to harvest the growth.
Well, God gives the growth, is what he says, and
God gives the growth.
Yeah, and that's what you see.
God gives the growth, but he still has human ministers to.
But what I was seeing was God giving the growth. Like here I am planting. I'm like digging holes and throwing C.S. Lewis books in.
Yes.
Waiting for something to germinate.
Yeah, it's like that.
But it's God who gives the growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Were you publishing as a Protestant since you were a Protestant Christian for so long in your academic career?
Yes, I was.
So was it more?
I've got a lot of Protestant readers. I respect them. I think they're,
amen.
I think they're great.
We have a lot of Protestant viewers.
Great. And I learned the gospel from my Protestant family, but
here's the question: were people more shocked at you going from Protestantism to Catholicism than atheism to Protestantism? Like since you were publishing,
I was not publishing yet when I was an atheist.
No, but so therefore, I suppose people were more shocked.
Any shock would have been a retrospective shock.
Yeah,
and usually, I had a lot of Protestant readers in those days, and they thought, well, thanks be to God that he took a guy who was such a mess and such an idiot as Budziszewski and brought even him to some measure of sanity.
Did you get any blowback coming into the Catholic Church?
Yes, I did. I had always thought of myself before this. For some years, I'd been more and more interested in Catholicism and thought of myself as sort of working the border. I was especially interested in things that were, Catholic-friendly Protestants, Protestant-friendly Catholics. Do you know what I mean? And would work with these people. And some organizations that I used to write for or work with didn't want me to anymore. Yeah. Others did. One organization that still wanted me to write for it changed their mind about what I could write. As a Protestant, I had said something admiring about Mary, and they thought, gee, this is helpful. This is a perspective we don't often see. And then when I said something even milder than that, as a Catholic, they thought, he's trying to foist this stuff on us.
The camel knows.
The camel knows. He's up to something now. He wasn't before, but now he is. So there were some problems. I worked with another guy who was. He used to work with me because he was Protestant, and he, like me, believed in natural law and wanted to foment a deeper appreciation of the natural law among Protestants. And I had coffee with them at a convention where he was present after I'd become Catholic, and he said he was very depressed. He wanted to know how I could do this. I mean, it was as though I'd stolen from my mother or something. How could you do this? I said, well, because I thought it was true. And he says, where am I going to find another Protestant who believes in natural law? Actually, there are a lot of Protestants these days who believe in natural law, but that was his lament. And I got some blowback even from Catholics. There was one Catholic guy who said, I almost sort of regret you becoming Catholic because I thought as a Protestant you were doing a lot of good work for natural law. And now you won't have that influence.
Sort of among Peter Kreeft says, and this, I think he says this tongue-in-cheek, but God prevented Lewis from becoming Catholic because as a Protestant, he's able to reach many more people. Obviously, he probably doesn't mean that, but you see the point.
Yeah. So I was a little deflated, okay? And another friend said, well, we had talked about Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant issues on a number of occasions, and we corresponded again, and I thought I should tell him I'd become Catholic, that I'd made some decisions about these things. He says, well, I'm very sorry that you're now following a schismatic patriarch.
He was Orthodox?
Yeah, he was Orthodox. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have good relations with a lot of Orthodox friends, but this guy was a little bit more bitter. Mm-hmm. I think he was still mad about what happened in Constantinople back all those centuries ago.
Long memories.
Long memories. A lot of people have long memories.
What's your advice to people who really want to be faithful Catholics today, but they're troubled by what they see, the scandals in the church, scandals around Pope Francis and the Vatican?
Yeah.
How are you handling it, and what's your advice?
Well, the first thing is to be absolutely honest that these things are terrible. These things are dreadful. But the second thing, sometimes I tell them, look, when I came into the church, I wasn't expecting to come into a bowl of daisies. I learned as a Protestant that there are always wolves among the flock, and that there are always things that go wrong. That the church is. It was one of my Protestant pastors once said the church is a hospital for sinners, and I said I still think that that's true. Why should we expect that there's not going to be scandal in the church? Why should we expect that the evil one, that the adversary, is not going to try to stir all that stuff up and use it in order to dishearten us, and allow the enemies of the faith to gloat and triumph? Of course, if the faith itself tells us that there are going to be perversions of the faith, that there are going to be false teachers, that there are going to be scandals, why should it shock us when it's true? Now, what we have to do is clean all that stuff up. I moaned and groaned once before. It was when I was getting very close to becoming Catholic. I moaned and groaned to a Catholic friend of mine. And I was talking about something. It was really very mild in retrospect. It was, I thought about a certain deviation in Mariology, where people could sometimes give the attention to Mary that belongs to Christ, which Mary herself would not have wanted, instead of devotion to Mary encouraging us toward Christ. And he said to me, he became very sage-looking, and he says, well, Jay, the church knows about this. And in 200 years, it'll all be taken care of. Now, one part of me says, that's outrageous. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But another part of me clicked, and it said, wait a minute. He's Catholic. My friend is Catholic. He's got a much longer time horizon than I do as a Protestant. And the church has gone through these things. There was Arianism in the early church where, they got all confused about the nature of Christ. And there's this and there's that. Something like 90, by some estimates, 90% of the bishops at that time were on the side of the heresy. We recovered from that. There was the corruption in the church, and got cleaned up in the Counter-Reformation. There's this and that. We've been through this before. He's got a longer time horizon. And so maybe he's onto something when he says in 200 years it'll all be taken care of. But I was willing to realize the Holy Spirit knows what he's doing. And it isn't as though we've lost the magisterium or we've lost the doctrine because people are being confusing in their teaching of it.
You're exactly right. I think what happened, though, is for many of us, we were given a narrative. You've got Pope Paul VI, who many of us didn't remember, and here he was, combating contraception and standing up for the truth when all these other Protestant churches were folding. Okay, good. That's all we know about him, apparently. Good. What about this John Paul II fella? Oh, very orthodox guy, champion, enemy of communism, promoter of the rosary. And then we got Benedict. So it was almost like this narrative that we were told, and which was
everything
true.
is just going to be up and up. We'll never have any problems.
So
with our
it's shocking. It's just shocking.
It is shocking.
But I love what you said there. You have to address the reality of the scandal.
Of course,
as opposed to
you
being
do.
like, no, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. How does that help? It doesn't help.
Yeah, I think that there is such a thing as not adding to the scandal by not blabbing about it more than you need to. In the earlier years of the present papacy, I didn't want to talk about confusing and ambiguous teaching and things like that at all. Because I thought, give the guy a chance and let these things be clarified and so forth. But it just went on for a while. I'll still be careful about how I speak.
Yeah.
I don't want to weaken the faith of people whose faith is already kind of weak.
Yeah.
But some things have to be talked about in a respectful way sometimes.
Yeah, and you can do it in a way that actually strengthens an argument for the papacy.
Yes,
right?
you can.
So prior to Pope Francis, when I worked at Catholic Answers and people would write in with their questions about papal infallibility,
yes,
we would of course assure them there was the standard line, papal infallibility doesn't mean impeccability. We're not saying the Pope's right with every statement he says. And then all of a sudden, when Pope Francis started saying things, if a Catholic still says that, like, oh, he's wrong, you would get battered by some Catholics, and you're like, no, but that was the whole point of infallibility. He's allowed to be wrong. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't be. It would be good if he wasn't, but...
Yes.
Yeah.
Would be good if he wasn't.
Somebody should call him about that. Talk to him about that.
Some should what?
Somebody should call him about that. Talk to him about
Give him
that.
a phone
It'd be good
call.
if he wasn't wrong.
Yeah. Hey, let's talk about your new book, How and How Not to Be Happy. I want to hold this up for the camera.
Okay.
I said this to you before, and I don't mean to inflate your ego, since pride's never done you any good. But I will say that you write incredibly clearly. You see that there, Neil? Is that working?
Mm-hmm. That's great.
And also winsomely. Like, you're very, it's charming and fun, playful almost. It's really good. I love how you write. And Peter Kreeft offered you the greatest endorsement ever. He said, just reading this brilliantly written book will make you happy. Shut up. Do you know, it's amazing. Not many people know this, but I wrote a little book on atheism, sent it to Peter Kreeft, and asked him to endorse it. It was my life's dream to have a book endorsed by Peter Kreeft. And he wrote back and went, this is really bad. I'm paraphrasing. He said, I'm surprised at how bad this is because I've heard you speak on the radio and I thought you were quite good, but this is not good at all. Yeah, something like that.
My golly.
I was so happy though. I was like, it was so beautiful to be slapped by Peter Kreeft. So I rewrote it and sent it to him, and he gave a good endorsement.
Oh, great. That's a
But I love the honesty,
story.
because sometimes you think, are people just saying this like to get their name on the back of a book or something? But anyway, so congrats on the book. Now this is, I guess you wrote this book first?
I wrote this book
I'm
first.
so excited to dig into this. Commentary on Thomas Aquinas' Treatise on Happiness and Ultimate Purpose. Bit of a tome.
Yep.
So you then put this out.
Yes, without any intended allusion to St. John of the Apocalypse. It's 666 pages long.
Oh dear.
Yes.
And you didn't know that before it went to print,
no,
right?
I didn't know that
You
it was
could
going to
But Neil, I'm pretty sure there's a link in the description. I think I've already put it there for this one, so people
top.
can check that out. But tell us how this book came about.
Well, it came about but one reason was because of this other
The
book.
commentary.
Yeah, because of the commentary. I thought, but first then I have to explain, well, why did I write the commentary? You know, I've been writing about natural law for a long time. So I wrote a line-by-line commentary on Thomas Aquinas' Treatise on Law. And then I was thinking, and I thought, but you know, he keeps talking about things that need further explication. He talks about virtue, and how much is somebody going to be able to do with this book if he says, is every precept of the natural law, connected with virtue? And so I wrote another line-by-line commentary on some selections from what he said about the virtues. And then I thought, well, even this presupposes some other stuff. What he says about the virtues doesn't make sense except in the context of happiness and purpose and whether we even have a purpose. So I wrote this line-by-line commentary on that. And there is actually another one out now on divine law. But anyway, after writing this...
I love it. I love that Aquinas wrote a commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and you've written a commentary on Aquinas' work on...
Yeah.
I'm going to write a commentary on this one day.
Crazy?
Yeah.
So now the thing is, look, even though my more scholarly books like this one, I try to make them accessible to ordinary readers. Let's face it. How many ordinary readers, no matter how motivated, no matter how intelligent, if they're not specialists, and if they're not assigned to do it by some professor, are going to want to read 606, whatever many pages that was, of line-by-line commentary. And so I thought, I need to write something that ordinary people can read. This is really important. And I took the liberty of doing it more my own take. So I may not be precisely replicating Thomas Aquinas' arguments in How and How Not to Be Happy, but I'm a Thomist, but I'm not just channeling Thomas.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one reason. Another reason is that, as we've talked about, when I was a young nihilist, I was desperately unhappy. Even after coming back to faith, I mean, I had joy in one sense. I knew it was going to be okay. But I thought that as far as this life goes, my life is a wreck now. The best thing that he can do is kill me, get me to heaven as quickly as possible. And so I was still pretty unhappy. And I'm living so I've been on both sides of this good life, bad life line. And I look around at my students, and a lot of them are desperately unhappy. Sometimes.
How can you tell?
Oh, well, I'll give you one example. One of the things I teach is Thomas Aquinas, and is Aristotle. In Aristotle's Nicomachean and Ethics, a lot of his writings originated in people taking notes from his students. And sometimes you can sort of see the lines of how he was questioning his students. You can see some of that. I don't know if the Nicomachean Ethics is one of the ones where that was based on lecture notes or not, but you can sort of see the lines of how he must have lectured. He says, and I would lead my students through an exercise very much like what he does in the first book of the book, the first chapter, we would say. He says, I say, well, I'll say to my students, what's the first thing you did when you got up this morning? I got out of bed, Professor. Okay, well, why did you get out of bed? Well, to start the day. Why did you start the day? So that I could do stuff. And stuff like what? Well, then I brushed my teeth. Well, why did you brush your teeth? Well, because I wanted them to be clean. Why did you want them to be clean? Well, so that people wouldn't avoid me and they wouldn't fall out, my teeth. And I say, why wouldn't you want them to fall out? Well, because health is good. And I would say, so it looks like you're telling me that everything you did for the sake of some good. Yes, of course. And I said, well, is there any good that you seek that isn't for the sake of some still further good, because we've gone in a chain here, but that you seek for its own sake? They always say happiness, just like Aristotle's students. And then I say to them, just like he does, I say, well, okay, what's happiness? Aristotle's students, then they all break. Some say honor, people thinking well of you, pleasure, wealth, virtue. My students give different answers too. Sometimes they give those answers, or they give versions of them. They won't say honor, but they'll say popularity, or they'll never say wealth, even though they are thinking it.
It's too obvious, too on the nose.
Too obvious. And this particular time, though, I was teaching freshmen. It was one of the most disheartening experiences that I ever had with this particular group. I got up to, it was going great, and I got up to that point, and I said, so what is happiness? And instead of the expected thing that they all have ideas about what happiness is, the first half dozen students who answered all gave variations on the answer, nothing but the absence of suffering and pain. The first one said that, and I said,
"Death will do that."
Yeah, death will do that. I said to one of them, "You're telling me what happiness isn't. You're not telling me what it is." So another one says, and he gives me variations. He just rephrases it, and I said, "Well, it sounds like you said what the other guy said. You're giving me the negative element. Tell me what the positive element is. What does happiness consist in?" The next four still gave variations on that. They could not get away from this. Then finally somebody says, well, I guess it's pleasure. Now, this made me realize, I thought about this a lot. Why didn't they give the expected answer? Why did they do this? And why the youngest students that I ever teach, especially? I think that there's something that some philosophers call the hedonistic paradox. You pursue pleasure as your end, as your goal, and you won't have it.
And you won't have it?
You won't have it. You do things for their own sake, and you may have pleasure. You
Yes.
pursue friendship for its own sake, and you'll have the pleasure of a friend. You pursue the truth and gain some knowledge, and you'll have the pleasure of that knowledge. You seek God with all your heart, and you'll have the pleasure of fellowship with Him. You seek beauty, and you'll have the pleasure of the beauty. But if you seek pleasure for its own sake, you won't have pleasure. You won't have pleasure. You'll probably have a lot of pain. That's called the hedonistic paradox. Now, most people, they may never have heard of the hedonistic paradox. Why should they have? But it used to be that they would maybe hit the hedonistic paradox, that they'd come up against the fact that you pursue pleasure as their goal in life and you don't have pleasure. Maybe when they're 35, 40, and they start burning out. And I thought that what was happening here was that my students, these very young students, were burning out much earlier because they
don't even aspire to pleasure. It sounds like they're not even aspiring to hedonism.
In the end, I think what happened was that they had aspired to pleasure and had thrown themselves into it with much less restraint than people in almost any other generation in history. One can come up with a couple of candidates from such generations, but with much less restraint. And so they were hitting the hedonistic paradox much earlier.
Interesting.
And after all that pain from trying to pursue pleasure, the only thing left was happiness must be just not having this pain. Now, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance here, a lot of self-deception. There was, because I was also getting on the mid-semester course survey, and one of them wrote, "I am having an awesome life." Boy, they didn't talk like people who were living awesome lives. They talked like people who are in terminal depression. Take away the pain, make it stop. And I, you see this. You see other signs, like there's that student I mentioned to you. Yes, I understand what you're talking about, Professor. I wish I could just fall in love and get married and be faithful to the woman forever, but I don't think it's possible. That's a statement of despair. That student is speaking from despair. One of my graduate students once, we were talking about happiness in Aristotle, maybe, and or maybe Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, she took the view. She was a hedonist, formally so. She took the view that happiness lies in pleasure. I said, but don't you find that pleasure always lets you down? It gets old, and there are pains that go along with it, and it's never enough. And she said, yes. And I said, well, then doesn't that suggest that happiness really lies somewhere else? She said, no. If there's pain, and if you never, it's never enough, and you always want something more, that's just the way it is. She was getting angry. That's just the way it is. It's instead of what is that saying? If life gives you lemons, make lemonade. It was like, if life gives you garbage, wallow in it. She was pitching her tent on a plain of salt and saying, don't come near me with speaking of hopes of something better, because there isn't anything, and I'm not going to be burned again. So I thought, okay, there's a lot of pain out there. I'd written a book about, partly in response to that pain, about the meaning of sex. So I thought, I need to write something about happiness.
What does Aquinas mean by happiness? What should we think happiness actually is?
Well, that can be taken in two different ways. It can be taken as, what do we mean by the word happiness, or in what does happiness lie?
Mm-hmm.
What we mean by happiness is not too hard. We mean fulfillment. We mean flourishing. We mean is something that is complete in itself and leaves nothing further to be desired. Something that is abiding, not just a fly-by-night thing that is here today and gone tomorrow. In analysis, we find out, in thinking about it, we find out some other things about it. It's something we're doing, not something we're feeling. But now, what does it lie in? That's another question. Thomas Aquinas goes through a whole bunch of things that people think it lies in. And I add some others here. He didn't mention some people think it lies in meaning, but they're relativists of meaning. Any old meaning will do. Or it lies in friendship or love or pleasure or wealth or this or that and the other. And in fact, none of these things are sufficient. He even considers, well, maybe it lies in virtue. And surprisingly, he doesn't think it lies in virtue. He thinks that virtues are necessary conditions of happiness. You've got to have virtue or you're not going to be happy. But it's not a magic key that makes you happy. I can be virtuous in being tortured, which is something the Stoics didn't get, by the way. They thought the perfectly virtuous man would be perfectly happy. Nothing could touch him anymore. And they also recommended suicide when life gets to be too much for you, okay? So there's a little cognitive dissonance there, too. So what is happiness then? Well, okay, we have to make a distinction between the incomplete,
yes,
fragmentary, partial happiness that is available in this life.
Felicitous. That distinction is so helpful.
And the complete, unfragmentary fulfillment and flourishing that is not interrupted and leaves nothing further to be desired. You could say beatitude. Okay? Happiness in the first sense. This fragmentary happiness, your best chance for it is practice the virtues and hope for luck. Because you do need some good fortune. And I call that the worldly wise man's view of happiness. Aristotle got that far. And he sort of sensed that there was something more when he talks about contemplation, but he didn't quite figure that out because contemplation for him is something philosophers do. Okay? Not something the seekers of God are doing. And there's something to that answer. It's pretty good if this life were all there is. Practice the virtues and hope for luck. It's nothing to sneeze at, gives you a basis for making decisions, even for teaching the young. But it really does leave you wanting, doesn't it? Even apart from the fact that you might not have luck. There's also the fact that even if you quote unquote have everything and have the virtue to know how to make good use of it, and if adversity does come, the virtue to be able to bear up better under adversity, there is still an unfulfilled longing for something that nothing in this world, nothing in the realm of nature, nothing in created existence can fulfill.
I actually find this distinction he makes very liberating because the reason you've never found yourself to be perfectly fulfilled or happy in this life is that it's not actually possible. This is a veil of tears.
Possible.
And when you hear that, you're like, okay, so good. I thought there was something terribly the matter with me. And there is, but it's still the case that perfect happiness won't be found in this life.
Perfect happiness will not be found in this life. This is really important because even a lot of Christians and a lot of Catholics get this wrong. Somebody said to me once, I go to church and I pray and I believe in God and I really desire God. And I want to have that experience of him in the Mass, but I find myself unfulfilled. And I say, well, of course you find yourself unfulfilled.
You are unfulfilled, yeah.
The Mass is only the anticipation of that. It's the gleam of that. It's the touch of that. The complete fulfillment of that we will not have until we are face to face with him.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying, what Aquinas is saying is the Blessed Virgin Mary weeping at the foot of the cross of her executed son is happier than the man or woman in a drug-fueled orgy right now.
Oh, yeah.
So that just blows people away, and it just shows this false understanding we have of happiness, namely subjective contentment.
Gee, I wish I'd said that in the book.
Yeah.
I don't say that, but I do say, we weep. And that's a reason for rejoicing, because if we were merely evolved mud, there was no God, we were the meaningless and purposeless result of a process that did not have us in mind, then we would be perfectly adapted to this world. We would not have these strange longings for we know not what. We wouldn't be weeping. If we're capable of weeping and saying, why isn't there more? Unless even the pagans were wrong and nature makes things in vain for nothing, why would that one longing be the only one that's for nothing? Then there is something more. We were made for war, and we can rejoice about that.
What if, though, this desire for something more is absurd, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot of people say it is.
But it's been wired into us, say, through evolution, so that we can advance and survive, and therefore survive?
Yeah, I think that's a hand-waving answer. Okay, the idea is we need something that presses us forward
propels
to survive.
us on, yeah.
Well, why isn't the fear of death enough to do that? We need something that presses us together to unify the group. Why not just have a gene that's for seeking unity in the group? We need to have to aspire to more comfort in existence than just have a gene for more comfort. Why should we, and those things can be satisfied. You're satisfied then when you have more comfort. You're satisfied then when you've managed to escape the teeth of the predator and you're still alive. You are satisfied because the group is cohering. You're satisfied because you're having children with your procreative partner. Okay, there are genes, these guys believe that there are genes for all those things. What does this one gene add? It has no adaptive value. If we were perfectly adapted, we wouldn't be frustrated, because that from a purely earthly point of view would be maladaptive. You'd be doing all the things that your other genes were driving you to do, and then being unhappy anyway. Well, what's the problem? Maybe you'd stop doing what the other genes are telling you to do. It's useless. I'll give it up. I'll hang it up. I'll just settle. Which some people do say.
Just to push a little bit, I mean, from a kind of strictly and I'm going to say like evolutionary perspective, just because you're saying like nature doesn't do anything without a purpose. But like, what would the benefit be of satisfaction then? Because if you're satisfied, then you stop moving and working.
Satisfaction is just a signal that whatever you were being pushed to has now been attained.
Right, but I'm saying, if you're saying that this lack of ultimate total satisfaction is a sign that we're suited and attenuated for something more than...
Okay, think of it this way. I'm not thinking of satisfaction in the abstract. I'm thinking of the satisfaction of this desire, the satisfaction of this desire, the satisfaction of this desire. I desire food, and if I get food, that desire is satisfied. My nervous system responds and tells me, you've got what I was trying to push you to get. Good job. Now here's a little endorphin boost. I want to. I need other people, and so I have this push to form social associations. I make a friend. Okay, good job. That desire has been satisfied. I have what it was pointing me to. You get that other little endorphin boost. What I'm saying is that there's another desire besides all those. It is a desire for something that is not like food, like mates, like even beauty, to be found in this world. It must exist too, or there'd be no point. There'd be no adaptive value to having the desire itself.
I want you to respond, but it sounds like what you're saying is it's not that there's just not enough food and not enough pleasure and not enough comfort to fill up our natural longings. You're saying that there's some longing independent of those natural longings.
Yeah, I believe that's true. What
would you say to that?
Well, I'm just thinking of, so we had Christopher West on a couple episodes ago, and he talks a lot about, like, when you eat, it isn't ultimately satisfying, and this or that, like the things you're talking about, and those types of partial satisfaction, like you're eating and now you don't, feel as strongly the need to eat anymore.
You don't feel it at all. When I'm full, I don't any desire to eat further.
Hey, do you mind trying to speak in the
so what I'm saying is I would push against that.
It's weird.
And maybe this isn't a fully articulated thing, but it seems to come up a lot, like, you're doing this or that on earth, but it's not really fully satisfying you. Why would we even assume that it would fully satisfy?
But the thing is that here is an example. As I remark in the book, let's take sometimes people think this longing that I'm talking about is just a sublimation of sexual desire. Freud would have said that. It's libido, okay? You've just got a case of mistaken identification here. I think it's the other way around. I have been married for 50 years this year, and love is sweet. Amorous desires can be quenched by amorous embraces. Now, it's true that eventually the amorous desire is aroused again, okay? But, at least for then, it can be quenched. Yet, in the sweetest experience, in the sweetest kiss, there is the scent of eternity.
100%, I get that.
And what's happening here is that there are two desires. And the one desire even seems to ignite and inflame the other. I desire my wife. And our affection for each other, the physical expressions of our affection for each other, the things that we do to build our life for each other, these can fulfill all of that. But they're igniting this other thing that has the fragrance of eternity, and we cannot satisfy we to each other cannot satisfy that because we are not eternity. My wife is not the eternal something. She's this here, and that's wonderful. But she's not that. I think people even divorce sometimes because they misunderstand this. They expect their love.
I'd say that's the primary reason people divorce.
It may very well be. The people may think, oh, it's because we fight over money. It's because of this. It's because of this. But why do you do that? Why do you fight over the money all the time? Because when you first fell in love, you had the desire for the other person, but there's also this other longing that's ignited, and you somehow expect that the other person is going to satisfy not just the desire for the other person, but that other longing too.
Yes.
She doesn't. She can't. She can't, and that's no flaw in her. But you think it must be a flaw in her, or it's a flaw in the marriage. And so let me try again with somebody else, or let me give up on love. No, that is a love for something different. You know, Plato was onto this, I think. He believes that he thinks it's the desire for the good as such, not this good thing, but transcendent goodness. That's getting close. That's getting close. But now, if nature makes nothing in vain, then it must be possible for that to be satisfied too. If it isn't satisfied by anything in this world, there must be something out of this world.
This is an argument based on our inner experience, right? It's very unlike the cosmological arguments of Aquinas. It's akin to the argument for objective moral truths or the argument from beauty. So do you think, that's my first statement, maybe you disagree with that, but do you think then that certain temperaments go along with your line of reasoning more than others?
I think some temperaments do go along with my reasoning more than others, and that's one of the reasons why it's helpful to have more than one argument for the existence of God.
Yeah.
Some people are very susceptible to this particular argument.
That totally rings true with me.
Yeah.
When I encounter something very beautiful, it's precisely at that moment that I'm aware I haven't got the thing I really want.
Yes, that's right. Now, some people don't seem to. They either don't experience this, or they experience it and they don't recognize it. I think that it is more likely that in most of these cases is that they're not sufficiently self-conscious to recognize it, rather than that they don't feel it at all. But I gave a talk about this recently, and a very intelligent man, a nice guy, asked a question. He was not hostile. And he said, but when I look at the moon, for instance, I'd use that as an example, looking into the face of the beloved, looking at the moon, I don't feel desire, I just feel admiration. Well, that may be true. Maybe there is no echoing of longing there. Or maybe it's just that he hasn't experienced it often. Or maybe he does experience it and doesn't recognize it and confuses it with just admiration. I'm not sure. But that was an argument that didn't press very far with him. I think I can say this. This is, even if not every human being experiences this, this is so widespread among human beings that has got to have some evidential value too.
Yeah, I think if people are wondering whether or not they get it, just ask yourself if you understand what this means. The pain of beauty. Yeah. You either get that or you don't. I absolutely get that. My gosh.
Yes, the pain, the pain of beauty. A lot of intensely beautiful, wonderful experiences do carry a kind of a pain with them. There's a pain.
Yes.
It's plangent. It's like the plucking of a cord.
I said it to you before we got on the show that it's like going to marriage expecting a main course and only getting the appetizer and then wondering where the bloody main course is. And either that leads to divorce or disillusionment, or to turn your gaze to the one who can.
And the best thing in a marriage is that you can turn your gaze together to that other thing. And you can walk together into that mystery that neither one of you can satisfy in each other, but you hold hands walking into that mystery, which is God.
I've only been married 15 years. I can't wait till I'm at 50 years. Please, God, that'll happen. I love my wife so much. She's such a great friend. And I just love that. I really feel like I think we've learned, you first learn intellectually, that the other isn't God.
Yeah.
But you don't realize when you get married, you kind of think the other one is God.
You really do.
That is to say, she does satisfy all my desires. You don't understand.
Yes.
But then give it 4 hours.
And then there can be disillusionment. And then you think, oh, she isn't God. What a mess this is. How did I get into this? And then you realize she isn't God, but that's okay. Because there is God and we can seek him together. And I learn about God from my wife. She is an instrument of his grace to me. I think she would say that about me, although I have much greater claim to say it about her. I can tell you, so there's a new kind of wonder that's evoked here, but it isn't the same as that initial wonder, which was based on mistaken identification.
One thing that Aquinas says won't make us happy, which I think surprises those who read him at first, is not even goods of the soul will make you happy.
And he's talking about the virtues, right. Yes, and the goods of the soul that we speak about, the spiritual goods, the goods of God's grace, the goods of communion with God, the goods of being healed by him, the goods of forgiveness, the goods of that flash of partaking of the divine life itself. That's not on Aristotle's list of the goods of the soul. The closest that he comes to it is he talks about contemplation. This is better than all the other pleasures. But he thinks of contemplation as the kind of thing philosophers do. There are these eternal truths. They don't wear out like we do, and they're eternal like we aren't. And so you contemplate them and try to understand them. And that's like his view of God himself. He believes that there is a God, but he's just this thing that has to be, and he's thought thinking itself. It's not as though God. It's not as though God. Yeah, it's exactly. It's not as though God is interested in you. He's perfect. Why would he care about you? You can't have friendship with God. Now, when Thomas Aquinas talks about contemplation, he means being taken up into that which we are contemplating. He means personal knowledge. He means contemplation of God like the contemplation of the face of the beloved, except that we won't fully see his face until we're there.
Let's take a break.
Yes.
And then come back. We've got questions that are filing in right now from our supporters on Locals and Patreon, and we'll get to them right after the break.
Okay.
Beautiful. when I go to the airport and they say, "Here you are, Mr. Fradd." I'm like, "It's Fradd." When they give you the ticket and they say, "Here you are, Mr." and they say something. What do they say to you at the airport?
Well, they say all kinds of things. Usually they say buds and giggle.
Buds and giggle.
Yes, or sometimes
you should change your name to that.
At the airport, they don't usually giggle because they're trained too well. But I get that from receptionists when I telephone somebody. They'll say, people will say Budweiser, or if they're working very hard, I don't know how you get Budweiser out of that. Or people see the first three letters and guess.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Or people will try to spell it phonetically in English instead of phonetically for Polish and say Budziszewski.
Is it Budziszewski?
It's Budziszewski.
I got that right.
Yeah. The DZ,
Thank you.
BU is boo, DZI is G.
All right.
SZEW is chef.
I mean,
so it makes sense in Polish.
That's just your truth, man. Budziszewski. All right. Fantastic.
Phonetic relativism.
And is Jay, what's your name? What's your first name?
Oh, I never tell.
Oh, good. I hope you don't. You should keep that a secret.
I had a teacher once back in graduate school who said it's like all those people in the Polish Communist Party. They're always M. Malinowski, J. Krakenacki. It's all these initials for the first name on the Politburo.
Did you choose to shorten it because your last name's so long? Because it's going to help with the YouTube thumbnail.
Well, it does help. And it doesn't sound discordant with Budziszewski.
Yeah, J. Budziszewski. It's good. You said you had one thing you wanted to add.
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add. For people who might not be susceptible to this argument that concerns longing, there's something very closely related to it. And we put this in the context of our love of our wives. I bet this has happened to you. It certainly happens to me. Sometimes rather often, I look at my wife's face, and it seems to be glowing. And it's not a light in the room that it's reflecting. It isn't really glowing, but it's very hard to realize that I'm not actually seeing it with the optical receptors in my eyes. There is some kind of radiance here. What is that? I think that a large reason why makeup cosmetics manufacturers put so much effort into trying to make the face glow, it isn't just because they want it to look rosy like a young nubile person of a certain age. They may think that, but what they're trying to do is reproduce that glow. Now, I think that what that is, it's a vision. This is a reflection of the light of God. We're being granted a glimpse of something like the image of God in this person, or how God views this person, or of how this soul is going to look in beatitude. I think Dante got that. That's because that's how he treats Beatrice in the comedy, and which taught me a lot about love, actually. So now, but again, you see that glow in the face. It's a divine glow, and so you could easily think that she's God. No, she isn't. She's not even a goddess. But there is a real reflection here. There is a real vision. And that drives us on to something else too.
All right. Well, look, we want to take questions now. We're going to take them from supporters first, and then if we have time, we'll take them from those in the live chat right now. But before we do, another ad read. That was less awkward because I just said it. Exodus 90. Have you heard of that? Doesn't matter. Here you go. You're about to. Buckle up. Exodus90.com/Matt is an ascetical program for men who want to take their faith to the next level. They give up a ton of stuff for 90 days. They give up, here you go, snacks between meals, alcohol, warm showers. What else do they give up? Oh, unnecessary internet activity. Ton of stuff like that. And they take on things like an hour of prayer every day. They read through the book of Exodus over 90 days. And all of this is done within a little fraternity. So I know sometimes like the pleasures of modern life can dull us to spiritual things. It's said that Aquinas said, I might be getting this wrong, that man can't live for long without pleasure. So if he doesn't have spiritual pleasure, he'll seek out, I've never seen him say this, but I think that's true. So check it out. Go to exodus90.com/Matt. Not only can you do this for 90 days, you can do it for Holy Week if you want. They have week-long sort of ascetical programs. Exodus90.com/Matt. Exodus90.com/Matt. Click the link in the description. At least go check them out. Their app is top-notch, and it might be a really good spiritual kick in the pants that you need. Exodus90.com/Matt.
You say this is for men?
Yeah.
That's interesting in itself, because this is something that we don't sufficiently think about in the church. The men want to do hard things.
Well, you know what else is really cool is that Exodus 90 chose, even when they had a handful of women clamoring for this, they're like, nah, we're just going to make this for men. And I like the way my wife put it. She's like, you know what? Women suffer so much with their bodies that maybe it's good that they don't take this on. It's also, there was this old thing back in the day called Ephesians5.org. I don't know if it's still a thing or not. You may as well check it out. And basically every Wednesday, men fasted on bread and water, either for their wives or the women in their lives. And then there was an Exodus, there was Ephesians 5 for women, but what they had to do was go to a church at some point on the first Wednesday or every Wednesday, whatever, and pray to receive the graces. It was very much a receptive initiator thing, plugging into our sexes, which I thought was good.
Yeah, I like that.
We have some questions, and then, we can chat about more if you like. Dear Lord. I just went to Walmart and bought a pack of 4 of these things because I keep losing my glasses, and I actually need them now. It's not about looking cool. It's just about getting through a sentence.
My ophthalmologist buys them in lots like that too, so that he can leave them all over the house, and he doesn't have to ever look for them.
Exactly, every room. Kyle Whittington says, now I haven't read these ahead of time. Maybe we've addressed some of this, but we can always recircle them. With wokeism being the golden calf of most universities, I've heard other parents wonder aloud if sending your kids to college is worth risking their souls. Can we, in good conscience, recommend that our children go to college immediately after high school? Good question, I think.
Well, I recommend to almost all young people that they take a break before going to college. Hardly any of them ever take the advice, or at least that between their sophomore year and their junior year that they take. Even some people call it a gap year, something like that. Work, and I mean not the kind of thing where you're still living off your parents. Work, support yourself. If you are living at home, pay your parents' rent, and learn some of the realities of life. When you do start college, or when you go back to college, you're going to have a very different sense of what college is all about. Things that you may be hearing from people that have no connection with ordinary experience at all, nuts, woke things. It's going to be easier to put them in perspective. I think that helps. But on the other hand, I also think that not everybody does have to go to college.
Right.
Some people should not, because they don't need it for what they want to do in life, and they will only saddle themselves with an enormous load of debt. Some people don't need it because they need a different kind of community nurture, and it would be like casting them adrift. So that if somebody is spiritually fragile, sending him 2,000 miles away from home and putting him in a crowd of hedonists is not a good idea. And I can understand the concern of parents like that, but most students who are in that situation understand it about themselves too. So I don't think everybody has to, but I don't think you have to be terrified either. The main thing is that your children need to be prepared ahead of time, and then they need to be not alone, but in spiritual fellowship, in a real church, in a student Christian fellowship when they get there.
Now, I don't know much about your school, but certainly I would suggest that people seriously consider good schools like Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ave Maria in Florida, Thomas Aquinas College in California, and now it's in Massachusetts, I believe. There's a great school in Wyoming too. I forget, Catholic College.
Wyoming Catholic College. I think it's just called Wyoming
Catholic College. There's some really good colleges.
I'm going to be speaking there this fall.
Terrific. Yeah, I'm really.
Yeah, some of these are great. Are really great schools. Now, it's possible that because you may need special training in something, you don't want to go to a school like that, or it's possible that I don't know if this applies to students so much, but it certainly applies to professors. I think some people are called to teach in committed Catholic schools, and I think some are called to teach in secular schools, sort of as missionaries. But Is that necessarily the case for your students? I'm not so sure.
Supporter Christina Britton says, what is the difference between happiness and satisfaction? I am satisfied with my life. God is giving way more than I deserve. Yet I am looking forward to the adventure that is eternity, she says.
Okay. Well, it sounds to me like our questioner here has already made the distinction between satisfaction and happiness correctly. She understands, she is satisfied because she, although she wants something more, she understands and submits joyfully to the fact that she will have it later in God, in seeing his face, and is not going to have it now. I think that's what she means by being satisfied. I will accept what he gives me now. I will be glad of it. I will try to use this as a stepping stone to be ready, to be receptive to his grace, so that I will see him face to face then. But I want that, and I long for it, and that's going to be way better than this stuff I'm satisfied with now. Now, many people will be satisfied in a different sense. They say, I'm satisfied with this life. That's not what she's saying. They say, I'm settling. There's no point in hoping for complete happiness. It's not available. I'm going to settle, buddy. And they mean that by satisfaction. That would be a dreadful mistake, and I'm very glad that our questioner isn't making it.
Yeah. We have another question here from a lady in Australia, Guadalupe. She says, I just woke up here in Australia. I only watched the end of the interview. I am a mother of 4 young adults. They are looking for their own path. One is rediscovering the Catholic goodness. The others do not refuse the faith, but they practice it sporadically. I pray constantly for the salvation of their souls. What else can I do? This is really something I think a lot of parents need to hear. How do they find and maintain peace when the people they love, and at least at one point in their life were in charge of, have abandoned the faith or have made shipwreck of the faith?
Yeah. Well, she may be asking, what can I do for them and to help them to rediscover the faith? She may be asking, what can I do for myself because I'm in sorrow over this? I think what she can do for them, it sounds like she's already doing. She's praying. I think that it might be a good idea to pray to St. Ambrose, pray to St. Monica. Monica, Augustine's mother, prayed tear after tear after tear for Augustine. And he was way, way out of faith, and look what happened. He became one of the greatest saints in the history of Christianity, I think partly because of a mother's tears. Another thing that you can do is be the best possible Christian and Catholic mother that you can be to this person, and encourage your son who is following the faith to be that to his siblings. Now, what about your own sorrow? Well, I think that there is the sorrow of knowing that they aren't in the faith, and there's the sorrow of not trusting God.
Yeah.
And we have to trust him. That's very hard.
Yeah.
And I don't think that trusting him is going to mean that the sorrow goes away, because we don't know what he's going to do. I don't think that trusting him means that the grief goes away. It's a lot easier to deal with if we're trusting him. But he does send hard things to us. And what we can do, this was one of the greatest things for me about being Catholic, to realize, when I'm suffering, we even tell this to the kids, offer it up. Offer it up to be united with Christ, so that we can be more closely conformed to him. He can use this in ways that we don't know, not only for our own salvation, but for the salvation of others. And, you may think, submitting to this, what is that? It means I'm just putting up with it. No, it's an activity. It's a spiritual activity. It has value in itself. It opens the gates for God's grace in ways that we don't see. And so I think that we can do that. I think even embracing the suffering of it. I was in sorrow for somebody not so long ago, and was awake at night thinking about it. And I said, okay, I don't just submit grudgingly to this. I will take this sorrow with both hands. I will accept it. I'll try to accept it with your help, like Christ accepted the cross. And that was a huge difference for me, not only in my emotional tenor, but in my spiritual life. So I have a lot to learn about this. And it sounds like this woman has already learned a lot about this. But that's the area in which I think that we need to, each of us, try to learn more.
Father Jacques Philippe wrote a little book called Searching for and Maintaining Peace, and in it he makes the point that prior to our conversion, we often want the wrong things and often in the wrong way. But once we become Christians, we have to grow from wanting the right things in the wrong way to wanting the right things in the right way, namely on God's timing.
Yes.
And certainly this is an opportunity for the devil to come in and shame you. If only you had done things differently, your children wouldn't be in this situation. It's because you're not more intelligent. You can't explain and defend the Catholic faith.
Yes.
And so the devil, his temptations and the situations that are the evil situations that are resulting cause us to lose peace, and that's precisely what God doesn't want.
Yes,
of
the
us.
self-blame is a very large part of that. When I completely lost my faith and became so crazy, and I was a nihilist, it wasn't because of anything wrong with what my parents had done or that my grandparents had done. No, it was all me. It was all me. This is the thing. If in order to create the possibility of beings who are not just divine robots, but beings who can be made in His image and who can love and who can choose the good, they have to be free. And,
I heard.
There it is.
I heard Jason Everett say that Adam and Eve had the best parent.
Yes.
And look what they did.
And look what they did. So, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. And thank you for the vulnerable question. Trad and Dixie, thanks for being a supporter, says, what is the best way to reconcile our human perception of happiness or joy while also striving to constantly live out God's will in our lives, which, at least on the surface, often doesn't conform to how we perceive happiness? I am a naturally melancholy person who struggles with this at times. As you answer that, could you also share with us if there's like a serious distinction that needs to be made between happiness and joy?
Well, there may be. Was St. Paul what we would ordinarily call happy when he was in prison?
Yeah.
No, he wasn't, completely fulfilled. But on the other hand, he spoke of experiencing joy. Now, this is a guy who at the same time said that our spirits are groaning, and the Holy Spirit is groaning together with us. We are longing to be. He compares it to the groaning of the whole universe, as like a woman in labor, and yet he can speak of this in the same breath as joy. So there is something here that I don't actually analyze in the book, but that is connected with it, and I think is very real. Now let's see. She talked about reconciling this. Perhaps what she had in mind in asking your question is, how can we reconcile what we know about happiness with the fact that we do suffer? And I think the answer to that is, look. We don't know all of the answers as though we could write them on the blackboard as the solutions to problems in algebra. We don't know all the answers to questions like, why do I suffer this? Why do I suffer that? But better than having those answers is the fact that we know what God thinks of our suffering, because He came among us. He took our suffering nature on Himself. He sweat, He bled. He took the worst of our suffering, which is the brokenness of our sin, upon Himself. So this is a guy we can trust with the rest of those answers. And I think that's actually one of the best answers to the problem of suffering. Sometimes people say, why does a good God permit suffering? And we try to give philosophical answers. And some of those philosophical answers are pretty down good. We talk about free will, we talk about this and we talk about that. But the better answer is that all those answers tell us something. They don't completely tell us everything that we need to know, but we can trust Him with the rest of the answer. Now, I can also appreciate the situation from which the woman is asking her question. She says she is sometimes prone to be melancholy. I would say that I am of a melancholic disposition, which is kind of curious because most people would say about me that I'm cheerful most of the time, and I am.
Yep.
When I was much younger, this was a much greater problem for me. Learning to cooperate with God's grace has helped enormously. It doesn't mean that melancholy or moods or these things are all going to go away. But we have to cooperate with God and say, okay, I'm really feeling low today. Do I need to feel like this for some reason? God, show me and help me get through this. Or is this something I don't need to feel and I brought it upon myself through some mistake of my own? Show me. And even though because of my melancholy, I don't feel like praying to you right now, I'm going to do it anyway. Help me. Because I feel low, I don't feel your presence. But remind me, you are not a feeling, and that you are here whether I feel you or not, and carry me through. One of the dear friends of my wife and I was a woman who was bipolar. She was subject to periodic, very, very deep depression. Just about the only thing that she could do when she was absolutely down. She prayed the rosary. And she said, this centers me. She said, it brings me back to myself and him and what it is all about. And I can endure this until it finishes. And, okay, it's not for nothing that we speak of mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. That's any doctrine of happiness that didn't address that is going to be seriously defective. And so, I hope this doesn't sound empty. I acknowledge this woman's sorrow. God acknowledges it too. He's with her in that sorrow right there.
Any other questions come in, Neil? Or?
Yeah, we had a couple. This is related. Maybe you've already answered this really. But Jimmy King says, hi, I don't know whether Q&A will take this, but let me give some context. My brother was made bedridden due to getting hit by a car. Having to deal with that, how does one be happy in the midst of tragedy?
Oof, yeah. If you could address me so you can speak into the microphone so it picks you up, okay?
Yeah. Well, one thing that we have to do is, I think, of course, we do have to think about happiness. I think we have to think about what is necessary. But a large part but happiness isn't the same thing as thinking all the time, am I happy now? Am I happy yet? Am I happy yet?
Seems like a great way to go insane, or to at least never to be happy.
To go insane, to obsess about this is a big mistake. Not that the person who is asking this question is obsessing, but there will be a tension. There will be a tendency. There will be a temptation to dwell upon the unhappiness of the situation. And I think that one thing that is good, not by one's own power, that's always the dreadful mistake, but in the strength of God, with the help of God's grace, to just do the duty of the hour, to do what is required in the minute, to lift the cup of water to his brother's lips, to help him to take his medicine, to help him to get clean, to just do these things, and try to do them the best we can. And accept the fact that there is real sorrow in this. There is real sorrow in this. That we're not doing something wrong if there is sorrow in this. Of course there's sorrow in this. But we can find joy in God even through this.
Let's maybe close on this, because this is fascinating. Let's talk about Aquinas' remedies for sorrow.
Sure.
He has 5 of them,
yes,
and they're surprising to people who aren't familiar with Aquinas.
I know, they expect something much more spiritual.
Yes.
He says,
I'll say them real quickly, and then maybe you can help us by going through them. A suitable good, like a pleasure. First thing he says is pleasure. I don't know the exact order, but friends, the sympathy of friends. Tears and groaning.
Yes.
Which to me means not just crying, but ugly crying.
Yeah.
Contemplation of the truth. And then finally, and everybody's favorite, sleep and baths.
Yes. I think he means warm baths. I don't think he means really cold ones.
No, he does not. Let's talk about those. What about pleasure?
I think they're very good. Pleasure means, of course, suitable pleasure. It means illicit pleasure. It doesn't mean getting myself bombed on alcohol or on drugs or sex or something
mindlessly
like that.
Scroll through Facebook or something.
Or mindlessly.
Like
Oh yes, that's right. But there, what does give you pleasure? I might have a conversation with my friend. I might go out and look at the sunset. It's gorgeous. I might find pleasure in gardening. I don't find pleasure in gardening, but
I might.
But a lot of people
do.
I might.
In some possible world, yeah.
Although I hate gardening, and I admire those people who do find pleasure in it. Or I might write a letter to a friend. I might do something else that gives me pleasure. There are all kinds of things that give me illicit pleasures. I can even as long as I'm within my calorie limit of the day, have a Milky Way bar.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all right.
Yes.
That's fine. In my case, it would be more likely have a dill pickle. We can do that. We can let's see what's next on the list.
Let's go. One of the things he says under this heading is, and it's brilliant. He says, "Pleasure is to sorrow what embodies sleep is to weariness." So
Yes,
just as
it
means seeks out
a
sleep
rest
in
from
order
us.
to restore, if I'm sorrow, I seek out pleasure in order to.
Yes. Now that's not his last word about pleasure. It's not all that pleasure is. It isn't just a relief from sorrow. He says pleasure is repose in a good or in a apparent good.
Suitable good, right?
The pleasure is not the good per se.
Yeah.
It's sort of good in a sense, but it's a secondary good. It is the experience of enjoyment of something else that is good, like the friendship, the cup of coffee, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Second one is the sympathy of friends. And one of the things he says two things. He says the first is, because when I see your sympathy for me, I know that you love me, and that gives me pleasure. The second reason, he says, and it's like the advice your mum gave you when you were 5, is you get to unburden yourself, because sorrow feels like a weight that's literally kind of bringing you down. And when I get to share that with you, it's like we share the weight.
Yeah,
Very practical advice.
St. Paul says, carry each other's burdens. We really can do that to some degree. And the sympathy of friends involves sometimes a friend taking that burden from us, sometimes by sharing it himself. So we need to sorrow with our friends. It needs to be not just a sort of an empty sorrow. Oh, I pity you. I feel sorry for you. But we can take some of that on ourselves.
And friends can do that, and they're in a position to do that because they want your good.
Because they love us.
So we need to cultivate good friendships, true friendships.
Yes, that was one of the things that I wanted to say because I'm glad you said it, because I had forgotten that I had meant to. Friends, there is a kind of a friendship and a kind of comfort in sorrow that is the wrong kind, where even if, for instance, our sorrow results from something that we've been doing wrong or some wrong attitude that we've had, the friend thinks, oh, I have to be sympathetic. I have to reinforce my friend in that. That's the meaning of compassion here. No, it isn't. Listening to how bad my friend feels is very important, but affirming whatever mistakes my friend may be making is not a part of that. So this needs to be the sorrow of true friends, of good friends, friends who have a commitment to our true good and who have some understanding of what our true good is.
Yeah. The next one is tears and groaning. And here he says what everyone's mum said to them when they were young. And it's so beautiful when you read it in the Summa. He says, because a hurtful thing hurts all the more when we keep it shut up. Mm-hmm. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, it is.
And he says that when we cry, it's that what we're focused on intently in the soul gets dispersed to outward things.
Yes.
So what do you have to say about that? Why is tears... Well, hang on. The other thing he says, which I love, especially as someone who's an introvert and hates to be taken to parties, is this line.
Is that you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He says, I feel very awkward. I hide behind my wife and just let her, and I find a couple of people sit with them, and I like that.
Yeah,
but I don't
it's
like
a funny
the
thing.
big
People
awkward...
think I'm an extrovert because I like to talk, but I'm like that too, and I don't know what to do at parties.
No, I don't either. I like a small group. I'll sit with them.
Yes,
I love that. Mm-hmm. But the mindless... not peripheral, but kind of surface chatter. I don't know how to do it. Getting in an elevator with somebody else is my worst nightmare because I don't know what to do. Hi. Oh, having a good day? Hate it. Okay. The second thing he says, and this has to do with the introvert thing, is nobody likes being on the outside what they're not actually in the inside.
Yeah.
Like it's comforting to a man to express what he actually feels. And that's what I should do at parties, just start crying. Point is, that's his second point. It's comforting to express what you're actually feeling. What else do you have to say about that?
Yes, I think that you also have to have a sense of when to stop crying.
Well, okay.
But
that's not. You need to first acknowledge his point before then telling.
Oh, of course. This is only a qualification of the point. It's only an addition to the point. Let yourself cry. Let yourself cry hard, and then
stop.
And then say, okay, I need to dry my tears now, and I need to get on with life. And I may need to cry again later, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's okay. But I need to function now. My kid needs a bath.
Yeah.
I need to make this meal. I need to, or my wife made the meal, and I'm washing the dishes. I need to do what I need to do. I need to prepare to teach my class. I need to go to work. I may need to cry again later, but now for now I can put that aside. And I think that's rather important. When I was there was a period of time I mentioned being very depressed when I was a young man, and at one point I remember this was very helpful to me. My wife said to me, "I think you've been depressed long enough. I think you can stop now." That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? It sounds crazy, but it was very liberating. I suddenly realized she's right. I don't have to. And I don't claim that kind of a thing always works. But in this particular case, it did. It was like something shutting off. Somebody once advised, a student of mine said she was feeling very bad about something. And her friend said, well, why don't you have a pity party for 10 minutes? And, she cried and cried and cried for 10 minutes. And then she shut it off after 10 minutes and she felt much better. So there is a time to shut it off, even if you may need to again. But by all means, yes, let yourself do this.
The next thing he says, and I might be getting the order wrong again, but contemplation of the truth. And let me just throw one quote at you and then get what you have to say here. I don't know who said this quote. All the good quotes seem to go to Chesterton to die if they have no one to attribute them to. So I'll just say maybe Chesterton. But I swear, if nobody tells me soon, I'm just going to say I said it. All right. Somebody said, maybe you can tell me, cows chew contentedly in the meadows while men smoke discontentedly in the bars. Isn't that good?
Yes, it is. It is good. It sounds a little.
I promise you won't find it. You're trying to look for it.
It sounds a little bit like Lewis, but I think Chesterton is. But I think Chesterton is more likely.
But I think this speaks to this point about we were made for something more than as we've said.
We were made for something more.
What does it mean to contemplate the truth? Why does that bring us joy?
Well, okay. Well, one thing that we can do. Well, the truth that we're talking about here isn't the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. It isn't the truth of social structure in Guatemala. It isn't the truth of how inflation is related to unemployment. It's the truth about God. We were made for truth. Our deepest longing. Oddly, Freud talked about all these kinds of neurotic things that can happen when you suppress libido. But it seems to me that the much more serious kinds of repressions that we suffer today are suppression of the longing for the truth. We tell ourselves we don't even long for it. I don't have to know. The universe is all crazy and that's okay with me. No, it isn't okay with you, but you can tell yourself that and it's not going to work for you. Or we suppress our consciences. No, acknowledge this. This is our highest desire. Even other desires like sociality, friendship. In us, friendship for us is not like companionship among the animals. The two cats feel warm together, or herding among cows. They have an impulse to hang around. A friendship for us is in part a partnership in the knowledge of the truth and in trying to live according to it. Mm-hmm. This is a wonderful aspiration. And one of the reasons why it's particularly relevant when we're sorrowful is that when we see truth completely in itself, in himself, face to face, then sorrow will be no more. And we can contemplate that truth and everything else we know about him. And it's that is hugely important.
You didn't find who it was attributed to?
No.
That's mine.
Okay.
From now on, I have given this talk. A lot of times I've used that quote. No one's told me who said it. I said it.
How many times have you smoked cigars in the baths?
In the past? What do you mean?
In the baths. Isn't that what that was? Smoke cigars in the baths?
But you don't know me. I do like cigars, so maybe there's a chance that was a legitimate question. No. I think it was the bars. That was my accent.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yes.
I was thinking, wow, that's dated.
No. Yeah. So it's cows chew contentedly in the meadows while men smoke discontentedly in the bars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bars.
Well,
bars.
The cow doesn't know anything better.
Yeah.
The cow doesn't aspire to the truth. It has no truth to contemplate. It doesn't know. Even what we call the cow's knowledge is not really knowledge as we know knowledge. The cow can't form universal concepts. It enjoys the grass, but it doesn't think to itself, this is grass.
Yeah.
It can't even do that.
Or even this is good.
Yeah.
Now, if happiness is the perfection of our nature, shouldn't we be able to say that cows can be perfect?
perfection for a cow is different than perfection
right.
for us.
Yes.
The cow does not have a rational nature. For me to experience the perfection of the cow would not be perfect. It would be a perversion of my nature.
Yes, and you'd be depressed because of it.
That's right.
Right?
I would
Especially
be depressed
because grass is difficult to
digest.
Anyway.
Well, people try to do this. Sometimes they imagine, well, we'll just live like the animals because that's natural, man.
Totally.
But it is profoundly unnatural for us because
100%.
we're not animals. And even somebody who says, I will live like the animals is not in fact living like the animals because he's thinking about it. The animals aren't.
Yeah.
He's conceptualizing it and rationalizing the process of living like an irrational creature.
Yeah, no animal has ever thought, let's live like the humans. Okay, final one is sleep and baths. And the point I just want to quickly make here before you answer this is, I think sometimes we Christians living in an post-Christian society, as I think we do, we tend to react against whatever the culture picks up, whatever society picks up. Mm-hmm. So if the society is talking about self-care, we quickly seek to demonize it however we can.
You don't have to care for yourself. You don't have to care for yourself. Yeah,
rubbish.
Just tough it out.
Nonsense.
Don't take a warm bath.
And certainly there can be perversions in what people mean by self-care, but this is essentially what Aquinas is talking about. And of course, his point is we are not merely, ghosts in the machine. Our bodies are equally a part of who we are. That's a line from you. Therefore, what we do with the body affects us because our bodies are us.
Of course, yeah. Our bodies are us, and our souls are us. They are both us. They are different aspects of us. We're neither disembodied spirits merely inhabiting a husk or a shell called the body, nor are we bodies that have this illusion of having a soul. We are soul and body united. So of course, the body affects the soul affects the body. Now it is possible, and there is something to reacting against that, it is possible to overdo this. I might sleep all the time and neglect my responsibilities and my duties and fall out of my moral routines and so sink deeper and deeper into depression. I have to try to motivate myself to do things, even when I'm depressed. But okay, have a good sleep. That's great. And being unhappy is tiring. It's not as though it isn't tiring at all, but a nap might do you good anyway. It's that sorrow, like any intense emotional experience, is really wearisome. It's really wearing. Even sometimes good emotions can really wear you out. You go through some very happy experience, and I think this is one of the reasons why people sometimes cry when they're happy. Yeah. It is a strain to be that happy.
That's right.
And our bodies now, maybe it'll be different with our resurrected bodies. I don't think that the joy is going to be a strain for them, but it's tough. We need a sleep is good. More sleep, of course, when you're unhappy, and a bath. Well, again, if you stay in there 24 hours a day in the bathtub, there is going to be a problem here, and it's not going to relieve your sorrow. But take a bath. Go ahead, do it. You feel better, and your body's going to tell you when it's time to get out, probably anyway, because the water cools off and it's
no longer pleasant.
It's no longer pleasant. You realize I need to soap up a little bit and rinse and just get out and the towel off. And the toweling off is pleasant too.
Good stuff. Well, that was awesome. Well, I want to tell people again to please check out Jay's book, How and How Not to Be Happy. I was about to read the subtitle and then realized there wasn't one.
There is none.
Well, there you go. Well, maybe it's how. Oh, no, it's not. All right. Check that book out. We've got a link in the description. And then this is probably for sale. Is it on Amazon?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Commentary on Thomas Aquinas' Treatise on Happiness and Ultimate Purpose. I'm probably the most excited person you've ever met about this book. I'm so excited to dig into this. So thank you for writing it. Where can people learn more about you? Do you have a website where all your books are?
Website.
What is that?
I do have a website.
We'll put it in the link in the description.
Okay. It's called The Underground Thomist.
I love it. What a great name.
I'm at a secular university. I am sort of below the radar.
Yeah.
If in some ways, if you just Google the phrase Underground Thomist, you'll come up with it. But what it is HTTPS : all that jazz.
We have a link in the description. All you have to do is scroll down and click it.
Okay,
we'll put it at the top.
Great.
Way easier.
Great. And I've got a blog there. I've got PDFs of a lot of my articles there. I've got links to my books there. I've got a little bit of explanation of my spiritual biography there. I've got, this and that and the other. I've got some stuff about teaching. So there are various kinds of resources for people who want to torture themselves learning more about me.
Very good. Well, for those who are watching, we are going to do a post-show wrap-up vid over on Patreon and Locals. So if you are one of those beautiful, attractive, intelligent supporters, please look out for that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. That was really awesome.